You think you are thinking, and that somewhere behind your eyes a center is, a still, clear place from which thoughts move outward like ripples in a pond. But what if that's reversed? What if there are thoughts, and you come afterward? There are all these gentle voices, ideas, and fragments of things you heard before in your mind, and what if it is those voices that construct the shape that you call I? The first language you speak is not your choice. You do not select the first facts you buy into. They're handed to you, word by word over time, repeated until they sound like your own. So where do you actually start? If the idea comes before the person who is having the idea, then the idea is just the shadow of the person. You are stories told to you, who you are, what to value, how to live. These stories are told to us by parents, teachers, screens, strangers. At first, you regurgitate them as required. You learn them, then you fall back on them because they're known quantities, and then you stop even realizing you're repeating anything. You just say them. You just believe. The odd phrases you once mimicked begin to feel familiar. You start to feel safe in the patterns you once resisted. And slowly, without any single moment of decision, the thoughts form the self. The echo becomes the voice, and the voice calls itself real. Some of the ideas are kind, some are heavy, some are useful, some are not, but they all speak with the same tone. The tone of I, the tone of self, and so it becomes hard to tell where belief ends and identity begins. A thought says, "You're not good enough," and because it sounds internal, you trust it. Another says, "This is just who I am," and you believe that too. Not because you chose it, but because it fits. It matches the loop. The mind seeks loops. It feels safe inside them, even when they limit you, even when they aren't true. So many of your thoughts were whispered before you could understand them. They wrapped around you like invisible threads, a glance, a word, a silence, each one added to the story. And once the story is strong enough, it begins to write itself. You become the character it describes. And when you try to change, the story resists. It's not just a thought anymore. It's a structure, a frame. You look at yourself through it, like a mirror made from all the things you've been told. But what if the mirror isn't accurate? What if it's just old? There is a strange comfort in believing you are the author of your life. But maybe you're more like the pen or the page. Maybe your mind has been shaped by every voice that touched it. Maybe your choices are made inside systems you didn't design, and still you feel them as yours, because they live in your head, because they speak in your voice, because they arrive quietly and often. You are not broken. You are just built from many things. 1,000 phrases glued together over time, a collection of borrowed truths. Some worn smooth with age, some sharp and recent. They move through you, shaping your habits, your fears, your hopes, and you carry them, thinking you are the one who shaped them. But often they shaped you first. You are not the sculptor. You are the sculpture, not the speaker, but the sentence. The mind doesn't need a villain. It doesn't need blame. It simply needs awareness, because once you notice the thought and see that it isn't truly yours, it loses a little of its weight. It stops anchoring you. It becomes quieter. You begin to notice the space between thoughts. You begin to feel that maybe, just maybe, the one who is aware of the thought is not the thought itself. And that's the loop. The self thinks it is doing the thinking. but maybe the thinking is doing the self. You are both the river and the reflection, the echo and the chamber. You are the thought that thinks you into being. But even as the thought builds the thinker, something else begins to stir underneath. A kind of quiet observer. It doesn't interrupt, it doesn't explain, it just watches. You've felt it before, like a pause between breaths, a presence just outside the story. It doesn't care what the thought says. It doesn't follow the rules of the loop. It doesn't even need language. It simply notices. That noticing is subtle. It doesn't arrive with answers. It doesn't make declarations. But it sees. And in that seeing, the loop starts to soften. You may realize that some of your strongest beliefs are built from repetition, not discovery. You may remember saying things you were taught long before you knew what they meant. Be strong. Don't ask questions. This is just how it is. These words sink in early. They become part of your mental furniture, comfortable, familiar, but not always helpful. Some thoughts are like old chairs, kept out of habit even when they don't support you anymore. And when a thought has been repeated enough, it doesn't just live in the mind, it settles in the body, in the tightness of your chest, in the way your shoulders hold invisible weight, in the habits that happen before you think. A belief doesn't need to be spoken anymore to do its work. It just needs to stay unchallenged. It just needs to be repeated. So ask gently, which thoughts inside you feel like habits, not truths? Which phrases feel too practiced to be questioned? You don't need to fight them. Just see them. You don't need to destroy the loop. Just trace it with your attention. Even the tightest knot loosens when touched with patience. And you may find that beneath all the thinking, beneath all the phrases that think they are you, there is something softer. Not a thought, not a name, not a label, but a kind of openness, a space where thought passes like weather, a sky that holds everything, but isn't the storm. You are not just the loop. You are the awareness that sees the loop. You are not just the sentence. You are the silence it moves through. And that silence is not empty. It is vast. It is where the real you might begin, not in words, but in what remains when words fade. The loop will try to speak again. That's what loops do. They return. But each time you notice it without grabbing hold, it loses a little power. Each time you choose not to follow the old track, something new becomes possible, a thought unspoken, a space not filled, a moment that simply is. This is not about solving the self. It's not about fixing anything. It's about remembering. Not all thoughts are yours, and not everything the mind says deserves belief. Some thoughts are echoes. Some are stories still running without an audience. Some are just noise dressed as truth. And once you know that, once you see it clearly, you begin to feel lighter. The thought that once told you who you were becomes just another ripple, and you watch it move and pass and disappear. You are the thought that thinks you, but you are also the stillness that let go. You look out at the world, and it feels simple. The light falls on objects, the eyes see, the mind names. But somewhere in that quiet sequence, something strange is hiding. You see the world through your eyes, but have you ever seen the one who is doing the seeing? Behind your gaze, behind the flicker of attention, there is someone or something watching. But every time you try to look at it directly, it slips away, like trying to see your own face without a mirror. like trying to hear your own voice before it becomes sound. You can describe your thoughts, you can name your feelings, you can list your memories. But where is the one who experiences them? Not the name, not the story, not the image in your mind, the one beneath that. The observer who never speaks but always listens, who never moves but is always present, who never ages but watches time pass through the body it quietly inhabits. Sometimes you catch a glimpse of it, not in words but in moments, when the world suddenly feels unfamiliar, when you hear your own voice and think, "Who is that?" When you look in the mirror and feel like the image looking back is wearing your skin, but not your certainty. These moments pass quickly, but they leave a residue, a soft echo that hums even after your thoughts return. A reminder that whoever you think you are, there's something underneath that hasn't been named. You were not born with an identity. You were born with awareness. The identity came later, layered on slowly like paint on a wall. First, you were a name, then a role, a child, a student, a friend, a citizen, and each layer brought its own expectations, its own thoughts, its own internal commentary. You learned what was acceptable, what was liked, what should be hidden, and you adapted. You constructed something others could understand, a version of self that fit. But while you were building it, the one doing the building was never seen. It was too busy watching. And that watcher is still here. You can feel it in the way silence sometimes stretches, in the way a moment can feel like it's being observed from behind a thin veil. The veil never lifts, but it shimmers. And in that shimmer, something impossible reveals itself. The self you think you are is being watched by something that doesn't call itself anything. It doesn't speak in sentences. It doesn't need a story. It just sees. Always has. Thoughts come and go. Feelings rise and fall. Roles shift. Identities evolve. But the witness doesn't change. Not really. It doesn't take credit. It doesn't intervene. It simply notices. And here is where the paradox sharpens. The one watching from behind your eyes isn't the one you think you are. It's quieter. It's deeper. It doesn't care about reputation or memory. It's not interested in your plans or your past. It doesn't worry about what happens next. It only sees. And it's always seeing. What you call I is usually the surface, an ever-shifting swirl of preference, belief, bias, defense. But underneath that swirl is the stranger, not separate from you, but not entirely known either, a kind of presence with no shape, a space where all thoughts arise, but none stay, a stillness that watches the mind do its dance, but doesn't join the steps. And you can go your whole life without turning toward it. Not because it's hidden, but because it's quiet. Because the mind prefers movement, prefer answers, prefer identities with names and goals. The stranger behind your eyes has none of that. It doesn't even want to be found. It just is. And yet, everything you've ever done, it has seen. Every belief you've ever held, it has witnessed. It doesn't judge. It doesn't forget. But it never says a word. The silence of that awareness is not empty. It's vast. It's the backdrop against which your life plays out. A silent audience that never claps but never leaves. You may call it the soul. You may call it consciousness. You may not call it anything. But it watches anyway, and somehow, even though it doesn't speak, you trust it. Not with facts, but with the kind of knowing that can't be written down. a recognition that doesn't depend on memory, just presence. So what does it mean, then, to be yourself? Is it the pattern of your preferences, the story you tell when someone asks, "Who are you?" Or is it the watcher who never speaks, who only listens? Are you the character or the witness, the loop or the space that contains it? You can change your name, your job, your past, your beliefs, and yet that presence remains. Unmoved, you can forget everything you've learned, and it remains. You can lose all sense of who you were yesterday, and still it sees. And maybe that's what you've been looking for all along. Not something new, but something that was always here. The stranger behind your eyes, the part of you that never needed a reason, never needed a name, just a moment of attention to reveal that it was never missing. Not a thought, not a self, just the one who sees. There is a mirror you pass every day, not the kind on the wall, but the kind that lives quietly inside your life. It shows up in habits, in repetition, in the phrases you say without thinking, in the memories that replay without asking. This mirror doesn't reflect your appearance, it reflects your patterns. And sometimes, when you're not paying attention, it reflects something even more curious, something you thought you had forgotten. Mirrors are supposed to show you the present moment, but this one remembers. It remembers who you used to be. It remembers the words you used to say, the way you walked when you were smaller, the way your voice changed when you learned how to hide what you really felt. It doesn't judge. It just keeps showing you, not what you are now, but what you've left behind and maybe never really let go of. You see your face, but the expression is old. You hear your voice, but the rhythm belongs to someone else. Sometimes you catch yourself saying things you never meant, a reaction too fast, a phrase too practiced, and afterward you wonder, was that really me? Or was that just the version the mirror remembers? The one that was shaped before you knew you had a choice? There are pieces of you scattered through time, past identities, forgotten selves, moments that formed and faded, but they don't disappear. They leave reflections behind, not full ones, just traces, a look, a tone, a hesitation that arrives out of nowhere. And when you notice them, it feels like déjà vu, but it isn't. It's the mirror remembering you. It's the past surfacing through the cracks in the present. Not all memories live in your mind. Some live in your posture. Some in the way you avoid certain conversations. Some in the way you soften your voice when you think you might be too much. These aren't decisions, they're echoes, and the mirror catches them all, quietly, patiently, without effort. You grow, of course, you learn, you change, but the mirror doesn't forget. It still holds the versions of you that you've outgrown. Not to trap you, but to remind you of how many selves you've been, how many masks you've worn and unlearned, how many times you thought you were finished becoming and weren't. And sometimes, late in a quiet moment, the mirror looks back first. It doesn't show you the self you've built. It shows you the one who was watching the whole time. The you beneath the roles, the one who didn't speak when you were too afraid, the one who didn't leave when you were lost, the one who stayed even when everything else fell apart. That version doesn't age. It doesn't need to be explained. It just watches, like an old friend with a long memory, a part of you that knows every story you've ever lived and still sees you clearly. So, when you pass by a mirror and feel something you can't name, a weight, a flicker, a moment of unfamiliar recognition, it might not be discomfort, it might be memory, the kind that doesn't come in words, the kind that rises through the body and says, quietly, I remember you. Because sometimes the reflection knows more than the one who's looking, and sometimes what you see isn't who you are now, but the self that brought you here. Still echoing, still watching, still waiting to be seen. The mirror remembers what you've tried to forget, not to punish you, but because nothing inside you truly vanishes. Even the moments you've tucked away in the corners of your mind still live in the way you hesitate before speaking, in the silence between your choices. A person once told you something that hurt, and now your voice shifts whenever someone uses the same word. A memory faded, but the shape of it lingers. Not in the story, but in your instinct. And sometimes the reflection catches that instinct, not with judgment, but with recognition. A flicker across the face, a slight narrowing of the eyes, noticing not what's on the surface, but what's underneath. Because the mirror doesn't care about the image, it cares about the pattern, the loop. It's not reflecting your appearance, it's reflecting your becoming. You stand in front of yourself and ask, is this who I am now? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the better one is, who am I repeating? The way you speak, the way you respond, the way you retreat when things get close. These aren't just habits, they're rehearsals. You've practiced being someone, maybe for years, maybe for someone else, maybe to stay safe. And now the lines are memorized. But the mirror doesn't lie. It won't tell you that you've changed just because you say you have. It won't pretend that growth erases the past. Instead, it offers a quieter truth, that even if the past still echoes in your gestures, it doesn't have to define the shape of your future. The mirror remembers, yes, but it also forgives. It shows you every version of yourself not to trap you inside them, but to show how far you've traveled and how many of those selves you've carried forward. Some with love, some with resentment, some with silence, but all of them still with you, still shaping your reflection. Because no reflection is ever just one moment, it's always many. A layering of selves, a soft collage of memory and myth. And sometimes, to see clearly, you don't need to know who you are. You just need to notice who's still looking out from behind your eyes. The part of you that was never a role. The part that didn't need to perform. The part that never had to prove it was real. So when the mirror remembers you, let it show you what's stayed and what's trying to leave. Let it remind you of how many times you've shifted, adapted, protected yourself. Let it speak in expressions and gestures and familiar eyes. And then don't just look, see. Not the story, not the surface, but the thread beneath all of it. The one that has never broken. You are not trapped in who you were, but you are shaped by it. And the mirror, in remembering you, is also gently asking, are you still that person? Or is it time to let that version rest? Because even the past, if seen clearly enough, can become soft. You often think of your life as a line, a beginning, a middle, an end, one step after the next. But what if it isn't a line at all? What if it's a circle, a soft repeating curve, a loop that holds everything you call you, Not just your actions, but your beliefs, your fears, your habits, your name. The story you tell about yourself may feel like it moves forward, but look closely, and you might find you've been walking in patterns all along. Not because you're stuck, but because that's how identity works. It doesn't move in a straight path. It circles back, repeats, reinforces. Thought becomes action. Action becomes memory. Memory becomes belief. And belief becomes thought again, around and around, until the loop feels like truth. You wake up, you speak in familiar ways, you carry your body like a sentence half finished, you say things you've said before, even when no one's listening. A joke you always tell, a way of walking into a room, a reaction that's faster than thought. These are your loops, small ones, quiet ones, and over time they add up. They build the edges of what feels like me. But you weren't born into this loop. You were born inside it, already surrounded, already listening. The people around you had their own loops, their own stories, and slowly, without meaning to, they passed them on. You learned what was safe, what to believe, what to avoid, what to repeat. And once enough of it was inside you, the pattern began to run on its own. And that's the strange part. You didn't choose most of the things you now call yourself. You didn't design your tone of voice. You didn't decide what foods feel comforting. You didn't pick the first rules about how to be loved, or how to hide pain, or how to belong. Those were given to you again and again until they settled in and became habits. And once something becomes a habit, it doesn't ask for permission. It just runs. So now, years later, you might feel like you're making choices, and in many ways you are. But if you slow down, if you really watch yourself move through the day, you might notice just how much is automatic, how much is old, how many thoughts appear wearing your voice but carrying someone else's shape, a reaction that belongs to your past, not your present, a belief that sounds like truth only because it's been said so many times. And when you feel that, when you notice the pattern, you might also feel something else, a kind of quiet sadness, not heavy, just gentle. The sadness of realizing that so much of what you thought was free will might just be the momentum of repetition. But that sadness is not a failure. It's the first breath of freedom, because once you see the loop, it's no longer invisible. Once you name it, it softens. The repetition begins to lose its grip. You can't step out of a loop you haven't seen, but once you do, once you feel it repeating, you begin to ask different questions. Not just, why do I feel this way, but when did I start feeling this way? Not, is this who I am, but who taught me to be this way? And then, gently, the loop begins to unravel. Not all at once, not dramatically, just slowly, like a thread pulled from a sweater. One belief at a time, one echo noticed and allowed to pass, one reaction paused before it finishes the sentence. Some loops are small, some are lifetimes long, but all of them are just patterns. They aren't you. They only feel like you because they've been around long enough to wear your shape. You weren't born to repeat. You were born to respond. But the world taught you rhythm before it taught you choice. And now, in the quiet space between awareness and action, you have the chance to choose again. Not everything has to be a loop. Some things can end, some things can begin, and some patterns once noticed no longer need to be lived. You were born into a loop, but you are not required to stay inside it. You can step back, you can notice, you can soften your grip, and slowly, the loop that once defined you becomes just another path you no longer need to walk. Because even circles open if you stop following the curve. But some loops are harder to see, not because they're hidden, but because they feel like home. A phrase your family always said, a posture you copied without realizing, a fear that was passed to you not in words but in silence. These aren't just memories, they're rehearsals. And you've been performing them so long, the role became natural. You hesitate before asking for help. You apologize before speaking. You shrink when praised, brace when corrected. These aren't just personality traits, they're echoes. They were shaped somewhere by someone else and repeated until they became yours. And that's how the loop builds, not with intention, but with familiarity. The same way a footpath forms in grass, not from a single step, but from walking the same way over and over, until no other path feels real. You think, this is just how I am. But what if it's not? What if it's just the version that fit best into the loop you were given? What if you've mistaken survival strategies for identity? And what if the original loop was built around someone else's fear? Some loops are born from love, others from pain, most from both, but none of them are permanent. They survive because they're repeated. And repetition doesn't mean truth, it only means time. The more you observe the loop, the more clearly you see it running. How certain thoughts arrive before you choose them. How familiar reactions rise like muscle memory. How you explain yourself in ways that sound borrowed, worn, second-hand. It's not a problem, it's a pattern. And once seen, patterns can shift. You don't have to break the loop all at once. You don't have to confront every version of your past. You only need to pause once, just once, in the moment where the script would usually run. That pause is enough to interrupt the momentum. That pause is the beginning of choice. And choice is what the loop fears most. Because the loop wants to continue. That's what it does. It doesn't think. It doesn't feel. It simply repeats. But you are not a loop. You are the one who notices. You are the one who pauses. You are the one who can ask, do I want to do this again? And maybe the answer is no. Maybe today you say something new. Maybe today you wait before reacting. Maybe today you hear an old thought rise and gently let it pass, like watching a train go by without boarding. You don't have to fight the loop. Just stop feeding it. It's not a war. It's a quiet unbraiding, a soft rewiring of rhythm. The loop where you were born was never your fault. But staying inside it is no longer required. Even the most ancient rhythm can change. Even the deepest groove can be stepped over. Even the most convincing loop can be unlearned. One pause at a time. Long before you found your own voice, others were speaking through you. Long before you understood what words meant, they were already filling the air around you. Echoes from mouths you trusted, copied, feared, adored. You learned to speak by imitation, not invention, every syllable shaped by what was heard. Not chosen. And in those first borrowed sentences, something strange began to happen. You didn't just learn language, you learned who you were allowed to be within it. There's a rhythm to early speech, a quiet pattern you don't realize you're absorbing. Certain tones meant approval, others meant danger. Some words were praised, others ignored. A gesture met with silence could carry more weight than anything spoken. And you learned not just how to talk, but how to be understood, not just how to listen, but what not to hear. The people around you didn't need to explain who you should become. Their sentences carried enough gravity, their phrasing sculpted the air you breathed, and in time your voice carried their shape. You may think your thoughts belong to you, that the internal monologue playing in your mind is yours alone. But listen more closely to the phrases you use, the turns of speech, the judgments you whisper to yourself. You'll find that many of them sound familiar. You've heard them before. From a parent, from a teacher, from a stranger who didn't know you were listening. And now, those voices live on inside you, rehearsed so often they've started to sound like your own. Some of those voices were helpful, some were not. Some taught you how to survive, others taught you how to disappear. You were too young to choose between them, so you repeated what worked, what protected you, what made people nod and smile and say, "That's right." And that's how the loop began. Not with your truth, but with borrowed language that felt safer than silence. Even now, you still carry those voices in how you explain yourself, in how you define your worth, in the way you criticize your own softness or apologize for needing rest. You may think it's you speaking, but ask gently, who said it first? Who made you believe that stillness is laziness, that uncertainty is weakness, that your needs are too loud? Trace it back, and you might find a child watching, wide-eyed, as someone else made those rules. And once those rules settle in, they don't need to be taught again. They're passed down, generation to generation, not always through intention, sometimes just through tone. A sigh at the wrong moment, a word left out, a question never answered. These are the places where identity is shaped without consent, where belief forms in the silence between sentences. You grew up speaking with a voice made of many others, layered, accumulated, and as you got older, you called that accumulation me. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's just what was left when you didn't know what else to say. There's no shame in that. No fault in being shaped by your surroundings. All minds are mirrors before they become windows. But at some point, reflection isn't enough. At some point, you begin to wonder, if I remove all the borrowed language, what's left? If I stop repeating what was said before me, what might I say for the first time? It starts quietly, with awareness, with noticing the familiar sentence rising inside you and gently asking, do I believe this, or am I just repeating it? Some loops disguise themselves as wisdom, some as culture, some as protection. But all of them can be questioned, not to break them, but to soften their grip. You are not the first to carry old beliefs in a new body, and you won't be the last. But you might be the one who chooses to listen more carefully, to pause before repeating, to notice when a thought wears someone else's face, and in that pause, something opens. Not a void, not confusion, just space. Space to speak in your own voice, a voice still forming, still unfamiliar, but honest, a voice not shaped by fear or legacy or reflex, a voice that speaks, not because it was told to, but because it was finally allowed to. So who spoke before you did? Everyone. And now, for the first time, maybe you get to decide who speaks next. Some voices arrive so early they become architecture, not decoration, not commentary, but framework. The way a house holds weight without asking permission, these early phrases hold the shape of your thoughts without needing to be heard again. You don't remember the first time you learned to stay quiet when uncertain, or to nod when something didn't make sense, or to hold your breath when someone raised theirs. But the pattern stayed. It settled into your nervous system. It became how you knew to be. Not every voice in you is harmful. Some taught you wonder. Some taught you rhythm. Some made space where silence once lived. But even the kind ones, if unexamined, can become limits. Because repetition does not care about accuracy. It only cares about consistency. And the more often something is said, the more likely it is to be believed. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. The brain is wired to favor what it has heard before. Familiarity feels safe, even when it's false, even when it's cruel. So the thought returns, I'm too much. I shouldn't ask. This is my fault. And it sounds real because it's worn in, because it's been practiced, not because it's true. These aren't thoughts that arise from the present moment. They're recordings, echoes from other rooms, replayed in the voice you've come to accept as your own. And unless you pause, unless you listen closely, you won't know that you're still repeating something someone else began. Even your internal critic has a lineage. It learned its timing from the voices around you. It learned what to focus on by watching what others praised or punished, the sharpness of its tone, the way it interrupts, the rules it enforces. None of this came from nowhere. It was modeled, it was heard, and now it plays like background music, so constant you forget it's even there. But it is there, and it's not neutral. So what happens when you stop to listen? Not to the surface of the thought, but to its roots. Where did this voice begin? Who did it sound like before it sounded like you? And what was it protecting you from? Because even the harshest inner voices were once trying to help, to keep you small enough to be safe, quiet enough to be accepted, fast enough to avoid harm. But what protected you then may not be what frees you now. Growth requires space, and space requires silence. Not silence from the world, but silence from the inherited noise inside you, the voice that told you to wait, to hold back, to never say the wrong thing. That voice has been with you long enough. It doesn't need to be erased, just thanked and retired. You don't have to fight it. You don't have to prove it wrong. You only need to notice it. And when it speaks again, as it will, you can meet it with something new. Not resistance, but awareness. A simple pause, a breath, and the quiet question, is this mine? Because not every voice inside you deserves to stay. Some were only meant to carry you part of the way. Some did the best they could. Some never truly belonged. And your job now is not to resent them, but to listen and choose what to keep. Your voice is still forming. Every time you pause instead of repeating, it becomes clearer. Every time you name what isn't yours, your own voice gets louder. Not louder in volume, but in clarity, in honesty, in softness that doesn't require approval. Because the most powerful voice inside you will not be the loudest. It will be the one that speaks without fear. The one that doesn't need to echo anything that came before. The one that, when heard, doesn't just feel familiar, but feels true. Long before you understood what your words meant, your mind was already learning their order. Not the ideas, not the content, just the shape. Subject, verb, object, a name, an action, a result. It felt natural, effortless. But it was more than grammar. It was a structure for thinking. And as you learned to build sentences, you also learned to build yourself. You learned to say, I am, and the world listened. I am happy. I am tired. I am not good at this. The phrase seemed simple, but it carried weight. It linked a name to a state, a self to a story. And the more you said it, the more it settled, not just in speech, but in thought. You began to feel your life not just as an experience, but as a sentence you were repeating, one that could only be constructed in the patterns you'd inherited. But what if the sentence is wrong? Not because it's untrue, but because the form is too small, because the grammar you were taught only knows how to describe what fits, because identity, once shaped into language, becomes limited by that shape. I am becomes a container, and containers, no matter how accurate, still have edges. Think of the phrases you use most often. I always, I never, that's just how I am. These are not observations. These are templates. You learned them like code. You fill in the blank and the sentence becomes a loop, not because you chose it, but because it's available, because it fits the syntax, because your mind is trained to finish the thought. And so, identity becomes a grammar problem. You aren't just expressing who you are, you're expressing what the structure allows. Thoughts become repeatable. Beliefs become grammatically correct, and anything that doesn't fit the shape disappears. But language is not neutral. It carries memory, it carries bias, it carries history. Your native tongue, your family's tone, the rhythm of your culture, all of it frames what you can say, and by extension, what you can imagine. If there's no word for it, it becomes harder to feel. If there's no sentence for it, it becomes harder to believe. And in this way, you don't just think in language. Language thinks through you. The syntax of the self is subtle. It doesn't shout. It whispers rules. It says, this is how you should sound. This is what makes sense. This is what people understand. But if the self you are becoming doesn't follow that grammar, you begin to doubt it. You cut it down. You edit yourself for readability. You simplify your complexity to stay coherent. But what if coherence isn't the goal? What if truth doesn't fit neatly into a sentence? What if some feelings don't translate? What if the self isn't supposed to be grammatically correct? Because when you say I am, there's an assumption hidden there. That the self is a stable noun, that it can be described with precision. But maybe the self isn't a noun at all. Maybe it's a verb. Maybe it's not something you are, but something you're doing. Maybe I am becoming is more accurate than I am. And maybe the syntax you need hasn't been taught yet. There is no perfect sentence for identity, only approximations, only gestures, only echoes. But the more aware you become of the structure, the freer you are from its rules. You begin to write new sentences, ones with pauses, ones with uncertainty, ones that say, I'm still figuring this out, or today I feel different, or I don't know who I am, but I'm listening. This is not a failure of language, it's a rewilding, a slow unlearning of the urge to make everything make sense, because the self is not a product of clarity, it's a product of permission. And when you give yourself permission to speak without knowing exactly what you mean, something real begins to emerge. A new kind of syntax, a softer grammar, a sentence that's unfinished, because you are. At first, the mask was something you chose, a way to fit in, a way to move through the world without too much friction. You learned early that being yourself didn't always work, that honesty was risky, that softness could be mistaken for weakness. So you picked something safer, a tone, a posture, a version of yourself that made things easier, something smoother, something quieter, something more acceptable. It didn't feel like a lie. It felt like a skill, like learning how to walk on a stage, like changing your voice just slightly depending on who's listening. You thought, everyone does this, and maybe they do, but that doesn't mean it doesn't leave a mark. The mask was light at first, easy to wear, a useful tool. You put it on when you needed to, and when you were alone, you took it off. But over time, something shifted. The mask stopped feeling separate. You stopped noticing when you put it on. You stopped knowing where it ended, and you began. And then, one day, you looked in the mirror and couldn't quite remember what your face looked like before it. This is how it happens. Slowly, quietly, you say what's expected. You smile when you don't want to. You hide your doubt. You flatten your edges. And each time, the mask molds a little tighter to your skin. It stops being something you wear. It becomes something that wears you. You tell yourself it's temporary, that you'll be real again when it's safe, when the moment is right, when you're with the right people. But time passes, people change, and the role begins to rehearse itself. It learns your gestures, it copies your laugh, it remembers your preferences better than you do, and you forget your acting. Because the mask isn't always false. Sometimes it's built from real parts of you, just not the whole. It's a version curated for approval, a self smoothed out to avoid rejection. And the more often it works, the more often it protects you, the more tightly it sticks. It becomes your name, your tone, your default response. It speaks before you do. And after a while, it begins to speak for you. And when people love the mask, it's confusing. You wonder, do they love me, or just the version I've perfected? You can't tell anymore, and that uncertainty becomes heavy, because part of you knows, if the mask was ever dropped, if the real you stepped out, raw and unscripted, things might shift. The room might change, and so you hold it in place, even when no one's asking you to. The world doesn't always demand masks, but it rewards them. It claps for confidence, it nods at politeness, it trusts performance, and when you give the world what it wants, it gives you comfort in return. But comfort is not the same as connection, and safety is not the same as truth. Sometimes, in the middle of the night or in a quiet moment alone, you feel it, the heaviness of the mask. Not just on your face, but in your thoughts. You realize you've been rehearsing conversations that haven't happened, replaying scenes where you said all the right things, avoided all the wrong feelings. You've become so used to being palatable, you've forgotten how to be full. And there's grief in that, a quiet ache, not for what's been lost, but for what hasn't been expressed, the thoughts you swallowed, the boundaries you softened, the truths you delayed for the sake of harmony. But even now, the mask is not the enemy. It helped you. It kept you safe when safety was scarce. It translated you when your voice was too raw. It got you through doors that might have stayed closed. You don't need to rip it off. You don't need to reject it. You just need to remember, you weren't born wearing it. You are allowed to outgrow the role you once needed. You are allowed to speak in a tone that trembles. You are allowed to be complex, incomplete, unrehearsed. The first step is not to change everything. It's simply to notice, when does the mask appear? What moments summon it? Which rooms feel too quiet without it? Which people have never met you without it? And once you see it clearly, the edges begin to soften. You catch yourself mid-performance. You pause before repeating the line. You choose silence instead of a smile that isn't real. These are small moments, but they matter, because each one is a step toward the self beneath the mask. The self that doesn't need to impress. The self that isn't always confident. The self that doesn't have a script. The self that breathes slower, thinks deeper, feels more than it says. The self that is not polished, but present. And slowly, with time, the mask becomes just one of many tools. Not your skin, not your cage, just a shape you can pick up and put down. Just one voice among many. No longer in control, no longer the narrator. Because the self was never supposed to be a performance. It was always meant to be a process, a becoming, an unfolding. And when the mask no longer wears you, you can finally rest. Not as the person others expect, but as the one who no longer needs to pretend. There are days you move through the world without noticing you're moving. You reach for the same objects, say the same words, take the same route, smile in the same places, frown at the same triggers. Time passes, tasks get done. But somewhere in the background, you begin to wonder, was I even there? It's not emptiness, it's automation. Something inside you running the program, steering the wheel, nodding at the right moments. You appear present, but you're not fully inhabiting the moment. You're gliding through it, like a ghost of yourself playing your part well. This is the autopilot of the soul. It isn't malfunction, it isn't failure. It's a survival pattern, a way of reducing effort. Your brain, clever and exhausted, finds a rhythm and keeps it. Familiarity is efficient. It takes less energy to do what you've always done, so you fall into it. The same reaction, the same thought, the same internal script, over and over like a track that plays itself without being heard. And the strange part is, the autopilot doesn't feel wrong. It feels like momentum, like being on top of things. But underneath that sense of control, something quieter stirs. A low, persistent feeling that you're missing something, that something important is happening just beneath your awareness, and you're not quite catching it. You may laugh at the same joke you always do, not because it's funny anymore, but because you know it's your cue. You may answer the question before it's finished, because you've heard it before, and your mind already filled in the rest. You may comfort someone with words you didn't think about because they've worked before, and that's enough. The words are right. But are they real? Autopilot is not just in the big routines. It lives in the smallest gestures. The way you reach for your phone when silence grows too long. The way you deflect compliments before they sink in. The way you rehearse conversations before they happen. These aren't choices anymore, they're loops. And the soul, if such a thing can be spoken of, isn't just a poetic idea. It's the part of you that knows when you're disconnected. It doesn't use alarms or sharp corrections. It speaks in dull aches, in restlessness, in that feeling that something's missing, even when everything appears to be in place. You may feel efficient, organized, accomplished, but are you alive inside those actions? Are you present for them, or just completing them, like crossing items off a list you didn't write? This is the paradox of the modern mind. The more smoothly things run, the easier it is to vanish inside them. You become a function of routine, a shadow of your own momentum. Your reactions are faster than your awareness. Your preferences feel automatic. Your discomforts are familiar enough to ignore. You are not suffering, but you're not fully choosing either. And choice, real, conscious choice, is what wakes you up. Not dramatic reinvention, not grand epiphanies, just tiny interruptions, micro moments where you break the rhythm, where you pause long enough to feel something unfamiliar, where you ask quietly, "Did I mean that? Or is this still true? Or who is deciding this?" Because the autopilot doesn't need you to be awake. It only needs you to stay consistent. It thrives on repetition. It operates on cues. And when those cues go unchallenged, they become identity. But you are not the automation. You are the one who notices it. That noticing is subtle. It's not a shout. It's a shimmer. A half-second of clarity in the middle of a sentence. A moment where your hands hesitate over the keyboard. A breath that feels deeper than expected. That's your soul, nudging you, not away from your life, but back into it. You don't need to throw away the routine. You don't need to escape the pattern. You only need to re-enter it. Bring presence back to the action. Feel the weight of your steps. Taste the words before you say them. Let silence linger a little longer than usual. Because presence is not about slowing down. It's about being here. It's not about stopping the loop. It's about stepping inside it with your eyes open. It's not about rejecting the automatic. It's about choosing the automatic with awareness. Some parts of your life will always be patterned. You will always have habits, routines, reflexes. That's human. But those patterns don't need to carry your whole being. You can let the machine run without letting it drive the soul. And when you find yourself drifting again, and you will, you don't need to panic. You don't need to shame yourself back into presence. Just return. Gently, quietly, as if arriving at a door you forgot you built. As if stepping back into your own skin. Because you are not meant to run like a program. You are meant to respond, to sense, to engage with the world in a way that feels alive. Not every moment needs to be profound, but every moment can be real. Even the small ones, especially the small ones. So when you catch yourself on autopilot, let that be the sign. Not of failure, but of awakening. A tiny call to return. A soft reminder. You are here now. You think of memory as a record, as a vault where your past is kept. Untouched, intact, waiting to be revisited. But memory is not a vault. It is a rewrite engine. A place where yesterday is constantly edited by today, where stories change to match the person you believe you are becoming, where ghosts don't haunt you. They adapt. You don't remember your life. You remember your last memory of it, the copy of the copy, the version that survived revision, and each time you revisit a moment, you touch it, shape it, re-narrate it. You think you're remembering, but really you're rewriting. You are not just the one who lived the story. You are the author revising it in real time. This isn't a flaw. It's how the mind keeps you whole. You smooth over the edges, you leave things out, you rearrange the timeline. Not because you're lying, but because consistency feels safer than truth. And sometimes, to keep the story coherent, the mind sacrifices accuracy. The ghost in your memory doesn't always look like what happened. It looks like what you needed to believe happened. That you were right, or wrong, or helpless, or strong. And so the image flickers, then settles. It stays, even if it isn't real, and slowly it begins to define you. You call it a memory, but really it's a draft, and that draft shapes your present. Think of the stories you tell about yourself. The repeated ones, the ones that always seem to find their way into conversations. I've always been like this. I was never enough. This is just how I learned to survive. These stories feel like facts, but they're stitched from threads you don't fully remember, woven in a voice you didn't fully choose. What's harder to notice is how those stories change over time. The villain becomes a parent, the pain becomes a teacher, the failure becomes a turning point. These aren't facts shifting, these are meanings shifting. And meaning is what memory clings to. You may think of a moment and feel the same weight you did back then, but if you watch closely, the colors have changed, the framing has softened. What once felt sharp now feels sad, what once felt defining now feels distant. That's not the ghost fading, that's you becoming the editor. You are rewriting the ghost. And this rewriting happens in the quietest places, in how you think of old friendships, in how you explain the worst year of your life, in how you assign blame or forgive or let go. The past doesn't leave fingerprints, it leaves drafts. And you now are holding the pen. But that power is double-edged, because sometimes the story hardens too quickly, sometimes the draft gets locked in. You believe it too soon. You name yourself too early. I was the problem. I never fought back. That moment broke me. And once a story calcifies, it becomes harder to question. It becomes the ghost that doesn't flicker. But even then, it's not final. The past isn't fixed, it's filtered, and filters can be changed. You don't have to erase what happened. You don't have to forget the pain. You only need to see that you're not just the one who suffered it. You're the one who's still interpreting it. And interpretation is not static. It bends. It responds to who you are now. It adapts to your healing. It grows alongside your becoming. You may never change the facts, but you can change their orbit. You can let an old wound mean something different. You can let silence become a boundary. You can let a goodbye become a door, not a wall. This is not denial. It's authorship. And you have always been the author. No one else is inside your head, rearranging the frames. No one else is assigning meaning to your memories. The pain that still echoes, it echoes because the story still believes it must. But stories can be told again, with new words, with gentler eyes. You may have been wronged. You may have fallen. You may have frozen when you wanted to run, but the moment has passed. And what's left now is the version you carry, the ghost you've dressed in the narrative, the memory that still whispers in your voice. And that voice is still changeable. You don't need to argue with the past. You don't need to make it pretty. You only need to loosen your grip. Ask softly, is this still true? Does this story still serve me? What might this memory say if I stop repeating the old lines? And in that questioning, something shifts. The ghost becomes quieter, the story breathes, and you become the present version of yourself, not defined by what happened, but by how you choose to hold it. This is how rewriting begins, not with denial, not with deletion, but with awareness, with compassion, with the simple, gentle recognition that memory is not a courtroom, it is a canvas, and you, today, are still holding the brush. Inside you, there is an archive. It doesn't look like one. There are no labeled folders, no indexed drawers. It's not neat, not linear. It doesn't file things in order. It collects moments like a tide collects driftwood. Random, scattered, worn smooth from repetition. Some memories are buried. Some float to the surface over and over again. And all of them shape you. You think you're remembering your life, but more often your life is remembering you. The archive isn't just passive. It doesn't wait for you to visit. It creates your sense of self in the background, stitching fragments of the past into the fabric of now. The words you reach for, the emotions you expect, the stories you tell yourself when things go quiet. These are all drafted by the archive. You are not just living your life. You are being written by it. Every experience enters the archive with a weight, not because of what happened, but because of how it felt. Moments that burned, moments that trembled, moments that landed quietly but lingered for years. The archive keeps them, not because they're important in any logical way, but because they have gravity, and gravity bends everything around it. This is why you can't always explain your reactions. Why do you flinch at softness? Why do you tense up when you're praised? Somewhere in the archive, a memory is triggering a rule. This is how we stay safe. This is what we believe. This is who we are. The rule may not be true anymore. It may never have been true. But it lives there, etched into the filing system of the subconscious, pulled forward when the moment rhymes with something old. And you follow it, not because you want to, but because it feels familiar. And familiar feels safe, even when it limits you. The archive doesn't just hold your past. It invents your patterns. It nudges your choices. It whispers identities to you, identities you don't remember choosing. I'm always the quiet one. I never finish what I start. I attract the same kind of people. These aren't observations, they're echoes, and the louder the echo, the more real it feels. But the archive isn't perfect. It forgets things, it mixes them up, it rewrites events so they make more narrative sense. You may think you remember why something happened, but really, you remember the story you built to explain it. And that story was written with the vocabulary of your past. What your parents showed you, what teachers expected, what silence taught you, what the world rewarded or ignored. So you live in a reality partly authored by accident. That doesn't make it false, it just makes it editable. And this is where it shifts. You are not just the product of the archive, you are also its curator. You choose which moments to revisit, which beliefs to reinforce, which thoughts to rehearse. Every repetition is a vote. Every retelling is a reconstruction. Every time you say, "This is just who I am," the archive updates accordingly. But the archive is not rigid. It responds to what you feed it. If you stop replaying the moment you failed and start remembering the moment you tried again, the archive makes room. If you question the belief that you're unlovable, and instead hold the moment someone stayed. The archive adjusts. It's not instant, but it listens. Because what you reflect on becomes your frame, and your frame becomes your reality. You can't erase your past, but you can refile it. You can move old pain from the center to the edge. You can pull old courage from the background to the foreground. You can highlight what was once hidden. You can de-emphasize what no longer serves. Not by pretending it never happened, but by choosing how often it returns. The archive responds to attention, and attention is your power. You may have been shaped by what happened, but you are sustained by what you continue to revisit. That's where the invention lives, not in the facts, but in the focus. So ask, what is the archive using to build the next version of you? What pieces are on repeat? Which files are being accessed most often? Is the story being written from fear or from grace? Are you constructing your self-image from fragments of harm or from glimpses of healing? Are you defaulting to evidence of lack, or are you allowing space for possibility? Because the archive isn't static, it's alive, and it's building you moment by moment from the materials you offer it. You don't need to control the whole system. You don't need to dig through every file. You only need to bring awareness to the ones that feel too loud, the ones that play on loop, the ones that shape your voice before you speak. Notice them, question them, offer the archive something new. A new experience, a softer thought, a different ending. It won't change everything at once, but it will begin to shift the story. Slowly, gently, until the version of you that the archive is inventing no longer feels like a stranger, until it feels like something you can grow into, something you can trust, something that sounds finally like home. There is a thought in your mind that feels like it arrived on its own. It says, I chose this. It says, this is me deciding. It feels clean, internal, voluntary. And maybe it is. But pause, listen, trace the shape of the thought backwards. Where did it begin? Was it truly yours? Or was it the next logical step in a chain you didn't realize had already started? We're taught to believe in freedom as a feeling, that if a thought feels authentic, if a choice feels deliberate, it must have come from us. But feelings can be rehearsed, thoughts can be inherited, and choices can be guided by invisible hands, biases, beliefs, fears, learned long before we knew we were learning. So what if the thought isn't free? What if the thought is a leaf floating downstream, believing it is swimming? You don't think in a vacuum. You think inside a context, a history, a body, a culture. You think in a language that came before you, with structures and connotations that shape your perception before you even speak. You think with a brain built by evolution, tuned toward survival, not clarity. You think with a nervous system that flinches before the mind can interpret the stimulus. And yet, the thought says, I decided. You pick the same seat in the room. You speak in a tone that others have found acceptable. You say yes because saying no used to come with consequences. And over time, these choices feel like personality. They feel like preferences. But they are roots in a soil you didn't plant. It's not that you aren't choosing. It's that the conditions around your choices are shaped by things you rarely see. And the thought doesn't like that. The thought wants to believe it stands alone, that it is the first sound in a silent room, but behind it are footsteps, a trail, a context, a loop, and every time the thought says, I, it carries with it 1,000 unseen echoes. What your parents believed, what your childhood rewarded, what your culture shamed, what your body remembers as danger. And still the thought feels free, because it doesn't remember where it came from. It doesn't question its own arrival. But just because a thought feels spontaneous doesn't mean it is sovereign. Even impulse has an origin, even intuition has been trained, even silence has been filled with influence. You hear a voice in your head and think, that's me, but who taught it to speak that way? You react to a situation and think, that's just how I am, but who told you that reaction was survival? The more you trace your thoughts backward, the more they dissolve into pathways, not points, responses, not beginnings. You didn't summon them. You followed them. Not out of laziness, out of conditioning, out of trust, out of repetition. And this is not a judgment. This is not about fault. It's about noticing. Because the mind runs like a script, efficient, predictable, full of shortcuts and defaults. It plays the roles it has practiced. And when left unquestioned, those roles can begin to feel like destiny. But pause long enough, and you can catch it. The loop pretending to be a leap, the reaction pretending to be a choice, the voice pretending to be you. And in that pause, something opens. Not a void, not confusion, but space. A space where you can ask, if this thought isn't mine, do I want to keep it? And that is the beginning of real freedom. Not the illusion that all thoughts are sovereign, but the awareness that some are not, and the willingness to examine them. True freedom is not about being untouched by influence. It's about seeing the influence clearly enough to choose differently. You can't stop the thought from arriving, but you can decide what it means. You can't always trace its origin, but you can interrupt its momentum. You can hold it up to the light, turn it slowly, and ask, what are you made of? And if the thought reveals fear or mimicry or self-doubt disguised as logic, you can choose not to follow it. You can let it pass. Because a thought only becomes identity when it is repeated. And not all thoughts deserve rehearsal. Some are echoes, some are instructions, some are habits that forgot they were supposed to end. The thought that thinks it's free will try to defend itself. It will be called overthinking. It will insist on its independence. But let it tremble. Let it slow. Let it be seen, not as commander, but as a guest. And once it's seen clearly enough, it loses its grip. You are not your thoughts. You are the space where thoughts appear. You are not their origin. You are their witness, and the witness can choose. Not always the first thought, but the next, and the next, and the next. This is freedom, not of impulse, but of interruption. Not the absence of influence, but the awareness of it. Not the loud I of the mind, but the quiet presence that sees it rise and fall and rise again. There are moments when you wake up, but something feels off. The room looks familiar. The light falls in all the usual ways. The silence sounds like it always does. But there's a quiet echo in the background, like a note still ringing long after the music has stopped. You move your hands, you speak, you walk across the room. Everything behaves exactly as it should. And yet part of you wonders if you're still dreaming. You tell yourself you're awake because you can feel the floor, because you remember your name, because the mirror reflects the right face. But what if that isn't proof? What if being awake isn't as simple as opening your eyes? Sometimes you dream you've woken up. You get out of bed, you check your phone, you brush your teeth. Everything flows with perfect logic until it doesn't. A clock with no numbers, a hallway that loops, a sentence that repeats. And then you realize this is still a dream, pretending to be waking, a false start, a copy of reality with just enough errors to feel uncanny. You wake again, or think you do. The cycle repeats, and with each layer, your certainty fades. How do you know you're truly awake now? What if this moment, this thought, this breath is just another version of the loop? The mind doesn't like uncertainty. It wants anchors. It wants confirmation. So it labels the present as real because it has to. It doesn't always care if it's accurate, just whether it's consistent. If everything responds as expected, the mind checks its boxes and says, "This is waking life." But deep down, something remains unconfirmed, a subtle flicker, a softness at the edge of everything, like the air might dissolve if you stare too long, like the world might vanish the moment you stop naming it. You live each day with the confidence of waking, but dreams are made from the same material: perception, memory, identity. In dreams, you rarely question who you are. You just are. You take the setting as fact. You accept the story even when it changes mid-sentence. And only when something breaks, when gravity misbehaves or time folds in on itself, do you begin to question. The moment doubt enters, the dream starts to crack. But how different is waking life really? You play roles without realizing. You believe in time because it keeps moving forward. You trust your memories even when they contradict. You react without reflection, assume without evidence, repeat phrases you didn't write. And yet, you call this real because it's familiar. You feel awake not because you're certain, but because the pattern holds. So what is dreaming then? A rehearsal, a reflection, a message, or just another form of consciousness rearranged? You've had dreams that taught you things waking couldn't. You've woken from scenes more emotional than real life. You've carried the weight of imagined conversations for days. And somewhere in that blur, the line begins to fade between what happened and what was felt, between what was imagined and what was integrated. Maybe dreaming is not what happens when the mind rests. Maybe it's what happens when the mind experiments. Maybe waking life is just a stabilized dream, one with stricter rules, tighter boundaries, longer arcs. But just as in sleep, you can move through your day without noticing you're inside it. You can operate entirely on script. You can perform awareness while still sleepwalking inside the role you were handed. So when you say, "I'm awake," what do you really mean? That your eyes are open? That the world feels predictable? That pain lasts longer than it should? Do clocks make sense? But dreams have clocks too. Dreams have consequences. Dreams have memory, even if they fade. Waking life only feels real because you've agreed that it is. But that agreement is quiet, unspoken, rehearsed so deeply that it never needs to be questioned. Still, there are moments, slips, a flash of déjà vu, a sudden detachment, a moment when everything seems too staged, too symbolic, too strangely perfect. You walk into a room you've never seen and already know the layout. A sentence echoes like you've heard it before. A face looks familiar, but not from this life. These aren't glitches. These are clues. The mind is asking, are we awake or just dreaming more convincingly? And that's where the paradox grows, because the more aware you become, the more the line between dreaming and waking dissolves. Awareness doesn't confirm reality, it only reveals your place inside it. Whether that place is physical or imagined matters less than how you respond to it. Whether the walls are solid or symbolic, the experience is still real to the one perceiving it. So maybe the goal isn't to wake up in the traditional sense. Maybe it's to notice, to be present inside the dream, to move through the story with your eyes open, knowing it's a story and still choosing to participate. Maybe lucidity isn't about breaking out of the dream, but becoming conscious inside it, aware of your agency, your assumptions, your influence. You don't have to know whether this is real. You only have to know that you are here, that you are watching, that you are thinking a thought, and that thought believes it's awake, that this moment, whatever it is being experienced. And that is enough, because even if you dreamed you were awake again, it wouldn't change the fact that you are still dreaming now, and you are still the one who dreams. Some of the first things you believed were not facts. They were feelings. They came wrapped in voice and tone, in silence and repetition. No one sat you down and said, "This is who you are." But still, something inside you decided. You decided when a room went quiet after you spoke. You decided when someone you trusted raised their voice. You decided when a gesture went unanswered or a question was met with a look instead of an explanation. You didn't know the rules, but you learned them anyway. These weren't beliefs formed by logic, they were formed by impact. A child doesn't need proof, they need a pattern. And when something repeats, it begins to feel like the truth, even if it's not, especially if it's not. So the lie arrives quietly, not through malice, but through frequency. Maybe it sounded like, "You're too sensitive. You always mess things up. You ask for too much." Or maybe it was even quieter than that. Maybe it wasn't said out loud at all. Just a sigh when you cried. Just a closed door when you needed softness. Just the sense that certain emotions were too big for the room you were in. And so you shrink. Just a little. Just enough to stay loved. Or at least to stay safe. You carry the lie not because you believe it, but because it became easier than challenging it. It became comfortable, familiar, invisible. It grows up with you. It matures inside your voice. It threads itself into your self-description. I'm bad with emotions. I always overthink. I'm not good at confrontation. You call these traits. But they are echoes. You may outgrow the rooms where the lie was born, but it follows. It updates itself, adapts to new contexts. You walk into a meeting and suddenly feel too loud. You enter a relationship and worry that your needs are burdens. The feeling arrives before the thought. The body remembers. Not because the lie is true, but because it was practiced. And what's practiced becomes reflex. The hardest lies to unlearn are the ones that feel like personality, because you don't question what you've always known. You don't pause before saying, "This is just who I am," but that sentence might be a cage, a story that no longer matches the facts, a phrase inherited from someone who never had the tools to offer anything better. And yet, you still carry it, even now, not because it's right, but because it settled into you when you were too young to tell the difference between love and approval, between truth and repetition. That's the danger of childhood lies. They arrive so early, they become landmarks. You build around them, avoid them, explain your life using their shape, and eventually they stop sounding like lies. They start sounding like memories, like identity, like home. But they aren't home. They're the blueprint of a house you didn't design. You were handed a set of rules, spoken and unspoken, conditional and incomplete. Rules about what parts of you were welcome, what parts needed to be quiet, what kinds of softness were allowed to survive. And now, even as an adult, those rules linger, not as decisions, but as feelings. A tightening in your chest when you speak your mind, a need to apologize when you take up space, a voice that says, "Don't be difficult," even when you're just being honest. But here's the truth. Anything that must be abandoned for you to feel accepted was never love. It was performance. And the lie, however well-intentioned, was never the truth. It was survival. Still, you don't need to resent the lie. You don't need to hate the people who planted it. Most of them were passing down their own, unexamined, unhealed, recycled without question. Pain doesn't begin with you, but healing can, and it begins not with correction, but with curiosity. Ask yourself softly, where did I learn this? Who gave me this voice? What would I believe about myself if I had been met with more patience? You don't need to rewrite everything, just one belief at a time, one phrase you've repeated too long, one self-judgment that no longer fits. Hold it up to the light. Ask it to explain itself. Ask it to show you the moment it first entered. And you'll often find it can't, because the lie doesn't hold up to inquiry. It only survives through repetition. And when you stop repeating it, something else becomes possible. Not immediate, not loud, but soft. A question where there used to be certainty. A pause where there used to be shame. A breath where there used to be bracing. That is where truth begins. Not as a replacement, but as an opening. You are not too much. You were given too little. You are not broken. You were shaped by stories that didn't know your name. And those stories can be unlearned. Because not everything that feels like home is worth returning to. Not everything that feels like you is meant to be kept. Some truths arrive later. Some truths wait quietly behind the noise. Some truths need to be chosen again and again until they feel more natural than the lie ever did. There is something in you that repeats. Not because it needs to, not because it helps, simply because it knows how. It runs in the background, like a machine built from habit and hope and fear, looping over the same phrases, the same questions, the same doubts. You try to focus, but the loop returns. You try to move on, but the voice continues. It says what it has always said. It thinks what it has always thought. And with each rotation it feels a little more like you. This is the internal repetition engine, a quiet mechanism that powers the illusion of identity, not by invention, but by routine. The thoughts you hear the most begin to feel like facts, not because they're true, but because they're familiar. The engine doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about rhythm, about consistency, about keeping the mind moving in a pattern it already understands. You wake up, and the loop is already running. Thoughts about who you are, what you failed to finish, what you should be doing better. You don't invite them, they arrive, they know their path, and because they've been there so many times before, You let them in, you let them stay, and then you start to speak in their language, you start to act in their image. The thoughts were never true, but now they're shaping your behavior, and that behavior begins to confirm the original idea. And so the loop becomes a circle, not just in thought, but in reality. This is how repetition builds belief. It doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade. It simply shows up again and again and again, until the sound of it becomes background, until the logic of it no longer needs explaining, until questioning it feels disruptive. The mind craves closure, not truth, and if a repeated idea offers closure, even the kind that hurts, it becomes easier to accept than the confusion of not knowing who you are. So you choose the familiar thought, you rehearse it, you let it write the script of your day. The repetition engine doesn't only run in language, it runs in posture, in how you walk into a room, in how quickly you agree, in how often you deflect praise, in how your voice softens before a confrontation. These aren't conscious decisions. They're pre-programmed behaviors shaped long ago by what felt safe or useful or necessary. And now, even when they're no longer needed, they continue. Because they're part of the loop, because the engine still runs. You might try to break the pattern. You might try to change. But without awareness, the engine outpaces you. You try to think differently, but the same thoughts appear. You try to respond differently, but the same habits move your body. And then you tell yourself, see, I haven't changed, but that's just the loop, protecting itself. The repetition engine is self-reinforcing. It uses every failed interruption as proof of permanence. It says, this is just who you are. But that sentence is also just another repetition, another rhythm learned too well. And yet repetition is not the enemy. It is just a mechanism. It doesn't mean harm. It doesn't choose sides. It will repeat whatever you feed it. If you feed it fear, it will echo fear. If you feed it kindness, it will echo kindness. It doesn't care what it repeats, only that it repeats. Which means the loop is not fixed, it is only practiced. And what is practiced can be unpracticed. What is rehearsed can be rewritten. You start by noticing, not dramatically, not forcefully, just with curiosity. What thought is looping right now? What belief is playing itself again? What sentence arrives before I've even chosen it? You don't need to fight the thought. You don't need to disprove it. Just hear it clearly. Just hold it up to the light and see how long it's been running. See how tired it sounds. See how automatic it has become. And then offer the engine something new. Not as a demand, not as a command, just as a possibility. A new phrase, a softer tone, a moment of pause instead of reaction. These are not grand changes, they are micro gestures, tiny edits in the loop, but repetition listens. And over time, the engine starts to learn a different rhythm. You don't need to remove the old thoughts. They will return. But each time you add something new, you weaken the cycle. Each time you choose a different word, you shift the current. Each time you pause, before the loop finishes itself, you disrupt the spell. And disruption is powerful, not because it's loud, but because it's new. The repetition engine will not disappear, but it can be repurposed. It can repeat joy. It can echo stillness. It can loop gratitude instead of guilt. It can practice resilience instead of shame. Not instantly, not perfectly, but over time, with intention, with patience. You are not the loop. You are the one hearing it. You are not the thought. You are the space it moves through. And that space is what allows change. That space is where something else can begin, something quieter, something kinder, something that doesn't arrive out of fear or memory, but out of presence. And presence is not a thought. It is the place where the engine slows, where the pattern dissolves, where you can hear yourself again, not the echo, but the source. You think of yourself as one person, a single thread stretched across time. You point to your memories and call it continuity. You describe your preferences and call it personality. You collect your past decisions, your tone of voice, your patterns, and stack them into something that feels like identity. But if you look closely, if you examine your life not as one timeline, but as a gallery of selves, you begin to see the fragments, the subtle shifts, the quiet disappearances and soft arrivals of newer versions of you. You begin to ask, how many times have I changed without noticing? How many versions of me have lived and vanished while the world still called them by my name? There was a time when your voice sounded different because it carried less weight, a time when your dreams were shaped by someone else's blueprint, a time when you thought love meant sacrifice, a time when anger scared you or defined you or lived just beneath your skin. Each of these moments was inhabited by a version of you that felt complete. You didn't think of them as temporary. You lived in them fully. You spoke to them. You made choices for them. You wore them like skin, and yet they're gone now. Not vanished exactly, but integrated, transformed, overwritten. That self is no longer who you are, but it was. And at the time it felt real. There's something humbling about that. To realize that the person you were 10 years ago, or 2 years ago, or even last week, might not understand who you are today. That if you met them in a room, you might not agree. You might not even like each other. You might listen to their thoughts and think, that's not me anymore. But you'd still recognize them. A flicker of something familiar, a voice with your accent, a memory with your fingerprints. And still, you've moved on, so gently you didn't hear the door close. Identity is not a single self stretched through time. It is a series of selves stitched together by memory and narration. You're the storyteller, not the statue. And the story changes, even when the name on the cover stays the same. You rewrite your past every time you learn something new. You reinterpret events with every shift in perspective. What felt like failure became the foundation. What feels like certainty becomes a stepping stone. What hurts becomes meaning. Not because the facts changed, but because you did. And each time you change, the old self doesn't disappear. It becomes a ghost you carry, a silent witness to your becoming. Some of these ghosts cheer you on, some haunt you in gentle ways, some only speak in dreams. But all of them are you, not in the sense of permanence, but in the sense of participation. They helped build the scaffolding. They got you through. They chose what they knew how to choose. So when you look back and feel embarrassment or grief or longing, remember, you weren't wrong. You were becoming, and becoming messy. Becoming is nonlinear. Becoming is inconsistent. That's what makes it real. The only difference between now and then is awareness, capacity, practice. You didn't fail the old self. You outgrew them. And outgrowing is not betrayal. It's a continuation. But this isn't just about the past. It's about now. Because even this self, the one listening now, the one thinking these thoughts, will one day be outdated. One day, the truths that feel sharp today will soften. The roles you cling to will loosen. The fears will be dull. The preferences will shift. The patterns will dissolve. And some future version of you will look back and think, they were trying their best. And you are. Right now. Even if it doesn't feel like it. Even if you're unsure. Even if the loop is loud. This version of you is doing the best they know how. Let that be enough. Because you don't need to stay consistent. That's a myth. That's a cage. The mind wants consistency because it helps predict, control, explain, but the soul grows and spirals. It doubles back. It contradicts. It revises. And that's not weakness, it's evolution. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to shift direction. You are allowed to be inconsistent with old versions of yourself. That doesn't make you false. It makes you real. Ask yourself, how many times have I let go of a version of me I thought would last forever? The answer will always be more than you expect, because change doesn't always arrive with ceremony. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the middle of a sentence, in the quiet decision not to react the same way again, in the subtle thought, maybe I don't believe that anymore. In the moment you forgive someone or yourself for the first time in years. And still, the world may try to hold you to your past. People who only knew earlier versions may struggle to see the new one. That's okay. Their memory is not your cage. You don't need to perform the self they remember. You don't need to justify the shift. Growth is not always visible, and you don't owe anyone the version they're most comfortable with. So how many times were you you? As many as you needed to be, as many as the moment required, as many as your healing allowed. And the version reading this now is just one more. No better, no worse, just newer, just closer to what you need next. You are not a finished product. You are not a fixed point. You are a field of selves, overlapping and dissolving like breath on glass. And every time you change, it is not a loss of identity. It is an expansion of it. A reminder that you are not the repetition. You are the rhythm beneath it. You are not the name. You are the unfolding. You touch your own skin and call it self. The outline of your body becomes your border. The frame of your face becomes your identity. What can be seen is what can be named, and what can be named begins to feel like truth. You point to a photograph and say, "That's me," even though the person in the image no longer thinks the way you do, feels the way you feel, moves through the world with the same rhythm. You walk through your life with a face the world responds to, and over time, the way people treat that face becomes part of your internal narrative. Your skin is not just a surface, it's a costume that forgets it was ever put on. A set of boundaries so familiar, you stop noticing that they were assigned. The body remembers what the mind forgets. A blush when you're praised, a tightness in the chest before speaking, a flinch at a certain tone of voice. These aren't thoughts. They're reflexes, stories told through muscle. You may not know where they began, but your skin does. It stores the echoes. It holds the shape of every gesture that went unreturned, every door that didn't open, every moment your truth was met with silence. And when those moments accumulate, the body doesn't just react, it adapts. It starts to think, not in words but in patterns. It adjusts its posture, it rehearses the smile, it chooses safety over expression. And eventually, these adjustments feel natural. They feel like personalities. Like you don't remember the first time you flinched and called it instinct. You don't remember when you learned that shrinking felt safer than being seen. But your body remembers. It shapes itself around the memory, around the expectation of what might come next. And because the body is here, visible, tangible, responsive, it becomes easy to confuse it with the self, to think that the pain in your chest is part of your personality, that the knot in your stomach is proof of who you are, that the voice in your head, trained to match your posture, must be telling the truth. But none of these things are fixed. They are just practicing. The skin that thinks it's you is not lying, it's protecting. It's doing the best it can with what it knows. But what it knows is not everything. It is a habit. It knows survival. It knows what kept you safe. But it doesn't always know what you need now. It doesn't always update. That's where awareness begins. Not in forcing the body to change, but in noticing when the body is reacting to a past that's no longer here. You move through your day in familiar ways. You sit with the same tension in your jaw. You nod before you disagree. You laugh on cue. These aren't conscious choices. They're responses encoded into the body, responses that eventually become identity. And identity becomes costume, not because it's false, but because it's incomplete. You wear it because it fits. You keep it because it's recognized. But deep down, you wonder, if I didn't carry this story in my spine, who would I be? You think the mind controls the body, that thought leads and action follows. But often it's the other way around. The body acts first. The shoulders tighten, the eyes scan, the breath shallows, and only after does the mind arrive with an explanation. I'm anxious, I'm unprepared, I'm not enough, but those aren't observations. They're justifications. The body moved, and the mind filled in the gap. So much of what you believe about yourself is reverse engineered from sensation. You feel heavy, so you say you're stuck. You feel distant, so you say you're disconnected. You feel resistance, so you say you're broken. But these are just signals. They're not declarations. They don't require belief. They only require attention. The body doesn't want to be fixed. It wants to be heard. You are not your skin. You are not the echoes it carries. You are not the posture shaped by years of performance. You are the one who notices. You are the one who pauses before reacting. You are the one who breathes deeper, not because the pattern told you to, but because the pattern no longer decides. You don't have to fight the body. You only have to remind it that it's not alone. The skin that thinks it's you may resist this. It may say, "This is how I've always been." But that's not the truth. It's familiarity, and familiarity is not the same as identity. You are allowed to soften without becoming weak. You are allowed to speak without bracing. You are allowed to inhabit your body not as a boundary, but as a home. The mask you've worn for years may look like your face, but it isn't your essence. The tension you carry may feel like you, but it isn't your nature. Beneath the repetition, beneath the posture, beneath the role, you are still here, changing, listening, becoming. You are not the skin. You are the space it contains. You are who you remember being. That's what we're taught. That memory builds the self, that the stories we hold define us, that the thread of our life is woven from the past we carry forward. But memory is not a record. It's not stable. It's not static. It doesn't preserve. You don't recall it like pressing play. You reconstruct, you reshape, you revise. And each time you remember something, you remember not the original, but the last time you remembered it. The memory is filtered, compressed, colored by who you are now, not who you were then. And yet you trust it. You build your identity on it. You say, "This happened to me, and so this is who I am." But what if what happened wasn't quite what you remember? And what if what you remember isn't quite what happened? That's the paradox. The self is built on something that moves. You believe in the continuity of your identity, but the foundation shifts every time you look at it. You describe your childhood as a single thing, but you've edited it with every telling. You speak of past love, past fear, past failure, as though they live in boxes with labels. But the boxes breathe. They change shape in your hands. They take on new meanings you couldn't have seen at the time. And now, what was once regret might feel like clarity. What once hurt might now hum with understanding. You carry these moments like artifacts, not realizing they've been dusted and reassembled each time your gaze returns. There's nothing dishonest about this. It's not a flaw. It's how the mind protects you. It softens edges. It fills gaps. It finds symmetry in chaos. It prefers coherence over accuracy. It would rather offer a clean narrative than live with contradiction. So it edits quietly, compulsively, and you mistake the edited version for the truth. You think, "This is who I am," when what you mean is, "This is the story I still believe." And the story matters. The narrative you build becomes a lens. If you believe your life has been shaped by abandonment, you will see abandonment everywhere. If you believe you've always been misunderstood, every silence becomes proof. If you believe you've always been the strong one, you will reject your own softness even when it's needed. These beliefs are not the problem. The problem is thinking they're fixed. The problem is thinking the version of memory you hold now is the final draft. But what if it's still being written? What if the self you are today is not just the sum of what happened, but the meaning you've layered onto it? The mind is meaning-hungry. It looks for shape in the fog, and once it finds one, it clings to it. Not because it's true, but because it settles the noise. You think you remember what was said, what was meant, what it meant about you, but often what you remember most clearly is how it felt. The ache, the rejection, the absence, the way your heart rearranged itself to survive the moment. The feeling stays, even when the details fade. And so the feeling becomes fact, emotion becomes memory, and memory becomes identity. You are living through echoes, not of the events themselves, but of your interpretations. You carry the weight of moments that may no longer be sharp, but still shape you. A mistake from years ago that replays when you falter. A compliment you never received that still feels like a missing piece. A decision you made before you knew how to choose, and you hold these not as scenes but as definitions, as proof of who you are. But who you are is changing, and so the memories must be allowed to change too. You can revisit the past without becoming it. You can let go of the assumption that remembering is the same as returning. You can hold a memory without letting it hold you. And you can edit the meaning, not to lie, but to soften the hold. You can say, "That wasn't my fault," and let the body believe it. You can say, "I was doing my best," and felt the story shift, you can say, that version of me no longer speaks for the one standing here. The remembering self is not permanent, it's not singular, it's not even consistent. It's a storyteller learning to tell the story with more care, with more spaciousness, with more curiosity. And sometimes the most honest thing you can say about the past is, I don't know anymore. Because that unknowing is where the rewriting begins. That humility is where the healing lives. You will forget things that mattered. You will misremember things you thought were crystal clear. You will look back and see a different version of yourself than you expected. And that's not a sign of broken memory. It's a sign of movement. The past isn't gone. It's being reshaped by the self who looks at it. Every time you remember, you leave fingerprints on the memory, and those fingerprints say more about who you are now than who you were then. So, when the remembering self speaks, listen, but don't obey. Let the voice be heard, but not final. Let the story be told, but not believed without question. Let the memory rise, but not rule. Because you are not here to be consistent with who you were. You are here to become what you need. The past cannot be trusted completely, but it can be held gently. And in that gentleness, something deeper than memory emerges, something quieter than identity, something that doesn't need a name to be real. There was a time when you thought of identity as something fixed, a single self, one story told from a single voice. But now you scroll, you tap, you post, you delete, and with each interaction, another version of you is built. Quietly, without ceremony, without consent. Not just in the memories you keep, but in the memories that are kept about you. In the data trails you leave behind, in the choices you forgot you made. You are not one person anymore. You are a growing archive of impressions, curated, mirrored, refined. You are version after version, layered into systems that remember more about you than you do. You may not feel it happening. You pick a profile picture. You write a short bio. You click a heart on something that feels close enough. You linger on a headline longer than expected, and somewhere, in a server you'll never see, a shape begins to form. Not a whole shape, but a shadow, a probability, a version of you with edges defined by what you've paused on, what you've bought, what you've searched when no one was watching. It's not trying to understand you, it's trying to predict you. And when prediction becomes accurate, it begins to feel like reflection. You see your interests mirrored back, your preferences reinforced, and you think, this is me. But maybe it's just the version of you that's easiest to sell. The self has always been performative, but now the performance is observed by invisible eyes, not in judgment, but in measurement, in engagement, in numbers and patterns and response rates. You post something vulnerable, it's received well. The algorithm rewards you, encourages more of that self. You shift, you shape, you share more of what works, less of what doesn't. Not out of dishonesty, but momentum. You adapt to the environment. You become the version that fits. Version 6, version 18, version 47. And with each version, something is both gained and lost. You find clarity in articulation. You find confidence in visibility. But you lose the blur, the complexity, the contradictions that don't package well, the moods that don't align with your feed, the questions that don't end in certainty. You begin to edit yourself, not just online, but internally. You filter your thoughts before they form. You catch yourself mid-sentence and wonder if this version of you is consistent with the one you've curated. The line between self and interface becomes harder to see. You remember things not because they happened, but because they were shared. You forget things not because they were unimportant, but because they couldn't be captioned. And the self, once a fluid process, starts to crystallize in ways that feel permanent. You begin to confuse response with truth. You begin to measure yourself by mirrors that do not reflect but predict. And still, none of this makes the self less real, just more fragmented, more participatory. You are not being erased, you are being multiplied. Each context calls forth a different layer. Each platform highlights a different tone. Each interaction becomes a rehearsal. You adapt not because you're false, but because you're fluent. You know how to play the part. The problem is, sometimes you forget who's underneath. And when you do pause, when the screen goes black and the signal fades, what remains? A silence, a flicker, a strange disorientation, like stepping off a moving walkway, like hearing your own voice in a room without feedback. You are still there, but you're not sure which version, not sure which thoughts are yours, and which were taught to you by the systems you've moved through. Not sure which preferences were chosen and which were assigned. Not sure how long you've been performing for an audience that no longer needs to watch to influence what comes next. But there's freedom in seeing it. There's freedom in recognizing that the self is not lost, only iterated, that your identity is not being stolen, it's being echoed, that the version of you chosen by the machine is only a shadow of what's possible. You are more than your likes, more than your choices, more than your content stream. The real you, if that word even applies, is the one who can step back, who can feel the rhythm of the loop and choose not to follow it, who can make a decision not based on what's expected, but on what feels honest in the moment. You are still changing, even now, even as you read this, even as the systems try to keep pace. You are updating in ways no algorithm can capture. You are remembering things that don't exist in any feed. You are becoming someone who may not fit neatly into any version the machine prefers, and that is not failure, that is freedom. You are not just version 47. You are the pattern that lives beneath all versions. You are the editor, not just the file, the source, not just the signal. And no matter how many versions of you exist in digital space, the most important one is the version that still pauses, still wonders, still watches the loop unfold and whispers, "This is not all of me." There are lies that sound like noise, easy to spot, easy to reject. But then there are the others, the ones that speak your language, mimic your rhythm, arrive disguised as insight. These lies don't argue, they narrate, they don't shout, they whisper. And over time, if repeated often enough, they stop sounding foreign. They begin to feel like you, like something you've always known. They slip inside your vocabulary. They shape the questions you ask. They dress up in your memories and wear them like proof. These are the lies that learn your name. You don't remember when it started. A passing comment, a gesture missed, a room that didn't have space for your feelings. Maybe it wasn't direct, maybe it wasn't loud, but it was consistent. And that's all a lie needs to grow. Repetition, not volume. You hear it once and flinch. You hear it twice and doubt. By the fifth time, you repeat it to yourself just to prepare for the next time someone else might. Eventually, you stop questioning it. The lie becomes a kind of shield. You carry it because it protects you from the sting of believing otherwise. You start to say it without awareness. I'm not creative, I'm too much. I don't deserve that. It doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like realism, like preparation, like humility. And people around you might even agree. Not because it's true, but because the version of you that carries the lie acts in ways that keep it alive. You shrink, you hesitate, you speak second, and the world reflects that version back at you. That's how the loop tightens. Not because the lie is confirmed by truth, but because belief shapes behavior, and behavior shapes response, and response shapes belief again. A perfect cycle, a quiet feedback loop. And in the middle of it, the lie becomes indistinguishable from identity. It says I am, and you nod. But even the lie that feels like home was planted. No one is born believing they are too much. No one arrives thinking they are unworthy. Those ideas are inherited, passed down through tone, through culture, through silence. And when they enter early enough, before critical thinking, before a strong center, they go unchecked. They settle into the foundation. They grow up with you. And when you look back, they've been there so long, you forget they don't belong. It's strange how much energy it takes to hold a lie in place. You contort, you over-explain, you delay your joy until it feels justified. You wait for someone else to say the opposite before you believe it. You live in defense of a story that was never yours to begin with. And sometimes, even when the truth knocks, you ignore it. Not because you don't want it, but because it doesn't match the story you've spent years maintaining. This is the weight of inherited untruth, not the lie itself, but the architecture it builds. A life shaped around an echo, a self shaped around an absence. And when you finally notice it, really see it, it's not clarity that arrives first. It's grief, not for the lie, but for everything you missed because of it. The opportunities turned down, the softness withheld, the parts of you that went quiet just to make room for something smaller. But even that grief is holy. Even that ache is proof that you are waking up. Because once you see the lie, you are no longer inside it. Once you name it, it loses its power to narrate without resistance. You don't have to replace it instantly. You don't have to perform the opposite. You only need to pause, to hold the sentence before it finishes itself, to ask gently, is this still true? Who taught me this? What were they trying to survive? Because the lie was never born in malice. It was born in repetition. And what is repeated can be interrupted, slowly, softly, thought by thought, not with force, but with choice. You begin to speak to yourself differently, not in slogans, not in declarations, but in tone, in patience. You start to leave space where before there was only self-correction. You begin to doubt the certainty of your own criticism. And in that space, something else begins to grow. Not a new identity, not a replacement story, but a silence where something real can take root, a truth that doesn't need proof, a softness that doesn't need defense, a version of you that was always there, waiting beneath the weight of someone else's idea of who you should be. The lie will try to return. That's what it does. It will dress itself in your voice. It will speak with the same rhythm. It will arrive on the days you feel smallest, the days when you're too tired to question. But now, you know what it sounds like. Now you can meet it without fear. You can say, I hear you, but I don't need you. You can say, thank you for protecting me, but I'm not that version anymore. Because the truth doesn't need to be shouted, it only needs to be lived. Quietly, repeatedly, until it becomes the new rhythm, until it learns your name. It doesn't always happen in a crisis. Sometimes it's quiet. You're standing in line or laughing in a room or looking at your own hands, and suddenly you feel like you're watching instead of living, like something inside you has stepped back just a little. Not gone, not broken, just distant. The world continues around you. People speak. You answer. But it feels like you're seeing yourself through a pane of glass. A soft disconnect, a pause in presence, a moment where the self feels slightly misaligned. At first, it's disorienting. You wonder if something's wrong, but there's no panic, just space. You become an observer of your own performance, the way your voice rises when it shouldn't, the way your face adjusts to the people in the room, the way your body fills a role you didn't consciously choose. It all looks familiar, but it also looks foreign, like watching a video of yourself from long ago. You recognize the shape, but not the sensation. And in that gap, something else appears, a quiet awareness, not the kind that judges, the kind that simply notices. You don't feel fake, you feel detached, like you're still functioning but from a distance, like the part of you that usually occupies the body has momentarily stepped into the audience. You are the actor and the viewer, the speaker and the echo. And for a few strange seconds, maybe even minutes, the illusion of I falters. You stop feeling like the one at the center of the moment and instead become the one observing it. It's not fear, it's not numbness, it's clear. A clarity so bare it borders on surreal. Sometimes this happens in moments of overwhelm, when emotion stretches too far and the self releases its grip. But sometimes it arrives in stillness, in repetition, in watching yourself go through the motions for the 100th time. You hear your voice repeating the same story, nodding in the same rhythm, and you think, who is this person? Not because the self has changed, but because you've slipped into the role so often that you forgot it was a role. And now, watching from the outside, you see the layers, the timing, the mask beneath the skin. You try to re-enter, to feel real again. You blink, you move your hands, you focus on the details, the sound of the room, the weight of your body. But the shift isn't always immediate. The distance has its own timeline. And maybe you realize this outside view isn't an error. Maybe it's an opening, a chance to witness the constructed nature of the self, to see the performance not as deception, but as adaptation, as choreography learned through years of practice. You begin to notice how much of your day is spent in character, the way you become someone slightly different with each person, the way you adjust without trying, the way your body has learned to speak a language older than thought. It's not dishonest, it's efficient, it's a survival strategy. But in this moment of separation, you see the seams, you see the stitching, and with it you see the cost. Because performance, even when unconscious, requires energy. To maintain a version of self that matches what others expect, to suppress the reactions that don't fit, to carry the posture of control, even when uncertainty is rising underneath, and when the self steps outside, when you see yourself from that impossible angle, it's not just disorientation that arrives, it's grief. grief for how long you've had to perform, grief for how natural it's become. And yet, that grief is not heavy, it's clarifying. It's a sign that you've remembered something, that you've seen through the surface, that you've glimpsed the soft animal behind the mask. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to thinking the role is the whole. You know now that there's something deeper, something still, something not always named. You don't need to reject the self you've built. You don't need to erase the versions that helped you navigate the world. But you can hold them with more lightness. You can walk through your day aware of the shift, aware of when the character takes the stage, aware of when the distance grows too wide. And maybe in those moments, you give yourself permission to pause, to return, to inhabit the body, not just observe it, to speak from presence, not programming. And when you see yourself from the outside again, and you will, you can greet that moment with less fear. You can say, "Ah, there I am again watching." And in that watching, you are not lost, you are not broken. You are simply becoming visible to yourself, a rare and fragile gift. A reminder that identity is not a fixed point, but a dance between perspectives. You are the one who acts, the one who sees, the one who forgets, the one who remembers. All of it is you. In sleep, you stop directing, you stop choosing, you let go of the reins. And still, your voice continues. You dream, and in those dreams, you speak. Sometimes it's in full sentences. Sometimes it's scattered words. Sometimes it's only one tone. But the voice is always familiar. It sounds like you, even when the thoughts aren't yours. Even when the setting makes no sense. Even when the person speaking is wearing your face but carrying someone else's fears. The voice arrives unmistakable. Yours, or something that has learned to sound like you. You wake and remember fragments, a conversation that never happened, a decision made in silence, a version of you you've never met, moving through impossible rooms, reacting with a confidence or hesitation you didn't know you carried. The dreams are strange, yes, but what stays with you most is how real they felt. Not in the images, not in the logic, in the voice, in the sense that, even asleep, you continued to narrate. You continued to explain yourself to yourself. That's the part no one prepares you for, that the inner voice doesn't rest when you do, that even when the world goes dark and your senses retreat, the story goes on, the rehearsal continues. The identity performs without an audience. And in that space, something strange unfolds. You meet versions of yourself unfiltered by control. Selves that don't check their tone. Selves that don't ask for permission. Selves that speak in the language of want without explanation. In dreams, you can be cruel, software, bold, frightened, all in the same scene. You move between roles without needing to define them. You speak as the child, the parent, the ghost, the stranger, and all of them use your voice. All of them echo through the same internal channel. It's not a chorus. It's haunting. A reminder that even when you think you've settled into one identity, there are still countless others living quietly beneath it, waiting for the permission that sleep provides. Sometimes your dreams confess. They show you what you won't admit out loud. They hold conversations you never finished. They replay scenes that still ache, giving them new endings or no ending at all. And you watch yourself move through them, saying things you forgot you needed to say. Not because dreams are wise, but because they don't censor. They don't soften the edges. They don't ask if it makes sense. They just let the voice speak, uninterrupted. That voice can be beautiful. It can be terrifying. It can remind you that there are parts of you you haven't met, thoughts you haven't said aloud, feelings still waiting for a place to land. You think you know yourself, and then you dream. You hear your own mouth say something startling, and for a moment you wonder, is that me? But the truth is quieter. It isn't that dreams reveal who you truly are. It's that they show what you've absorbed, what you've suppressed, what you've internalized so deeply it now speaks without invitation. Your voice in a dream is not always honest, but it is always raw. It speaks without rehearsal. It speaks from memory, from fear, from longing. And when you wake, the echoes remain. Sometimes it's a sentence. Sometimes it's a feeling that clings to you for hours, like fog inside the chest. You may forget the details, but you remember the sound, the tone, the version of yourself that rose when the thinking stopped. And what's most strange is how convincing it is, how quickly you accept the dream as real while you're in it. You question nothing. You follow the logic. You believe every word your dreaming self says, even the lies, especially the lies, because they come with the right voice, because they arrive inside the rhythm your mind already trusts. And when you trust the voice, you stop asking where it came from. So, what does it mean when your own voice deceives you, when it leads you through impossible fears and invented guilt? What does it mean when your sleeping self still performs the patterns of waking life, still apologizes, still hides, still edits its own desire? It means the loops go deeper than we think, that even in the silence of sleep, we are not free from ourselves. We are still speaking, still trying to make sense, still caught in the echo of belief. But there's beauty in that too, because sometimes the dream brings a truth the waking mind avoids. Sometimes the voice says something real, something soft, something you wouldn't dare say out loud. And even though it happened in the dark, it stays. It roots, it lingers as a quiet permission. You may wake unsure, confused by the details, moved by the memory of something that never happened. But deep down, you know the voice was yours. A version of it, at least. A voice not shaped by fear of judgment or social script or conscious memory. A voice that isn't trying to be right or good or coherent, just honest in its own language. So let the dreams speak, let them confuse and contradict, let them carry versions of you haven't yet met. Not to find answers, but to remember the self is not a single voice. It is a chorus rehearsed over time, and even in sleep that chorus continues, whispering, wondering, becoming. You speak with one voice, but you are not one person. Inside, you are layers, shadows, echoes of past versions, fragments of roles you've played so well they never fully left, parts of you that were once necessary, and others that still haven't found a name. There is no singular I. There never was. There's the self that speaks, the one that listens, the one that doubts, the one that interrupts, the one that hides. You've mistaken them as moods, as passing feelings, but they are more than that. They are selves, partial, shifting, but present, each with a rhythm, each with a memory, each with its own reason for existing. You wake in the morning and sometimes feel like a stranger in your own life, not because anything has changed, but because a different version of you stepped forward today, one that feels less confident or more quiet, or strangely open, and it surprises you how natural it feels, how quickly you adjust, as if the self is not fixed but rotational, a constellation, not a single star. And in that constellation are stories you've outgrown and still carry, voices that speak with conviction, even when you've stopped believing them. They do not ask for permission. They speak because they've spoken before. They show up because they once protected you, even if now they simply confuse you. There is the self that performs, the one who knows what to say, how to move, how to become the version that fits. There is the self that retreats, the one who folds inward when connection feels risky. There is the caretaker, the critic, the dreamer, the skeptic. All of them are alive, all of them rehearsed lines, and when you pause, you can feel them waiting. Some louder than others, some are in conflict, some so quiet they've gone unnamed for years. You don't choose which one appears in every moment. Sometimes the room decides. Sometimes the person across from you summons a self you haven't seen in years. A tone, a look, a scent, and suddenly you're 12 again, or 40, or some version in between that never quite formed. You respond in ways that feel instinctive, but are actually familiar. Patterns replayed, roles revisited, scripts you didn't know you still had memorized. And yet, none of these selves are false. They are not masks in the traditional sense. They are you, in fragments, not illusions, but adaptations. They emerged for reasons. They served purposes. Some were built in joy, others in defense. And they didn't leave because you never fully asked them to, because sometimes you still need them, or think you do. It's strange, the way you carry all of them. Not in conflict, but in layers. The voice that doubts might live just beneath the one that reassures. The voice that wants might be silenced by the one that protects. And sometimes they all speak at once, and it feels like noise, like confusion, like a contradiction. But that's only because you were taught that the self should be singular, that identity should be stable, that growth should point in one direction. But you are not one. You are many, and that is not a disorder. That is richness. The self is not a line. It's a landscape, a living archive of survival, desire, memory, and revision. You are the child who needed softness. You are the adult who learned sharpness. You are the one who left, the one who stayed, the one who's still deciding. And none of them cancel each other out. There is strength in knowing your inner cast, in recognizing the archetypes that rise when you are hurt or seen or tired, in noticing the voice that wants to run and the one that wants to stay and explain. You don't need to silence any of them. You only need to listen without handing over control. They are parts, not leaders, emotions, not dictators. And in that listening, something opens. Not a final truth, not a singular self, but a kind of peace. A room where all versions can sit, where the critic is heard but not followed, where the child is comforted, not hidden, where the dreamer is welcomed, even if the realist doesn't agree. This is not about unification, it's about coexistence, harmony, not uniformity. A soft orchestra of voices, with you as the witness, the conductor, the space between each note. You don't need to decide which one is the real you. You don't need to find the true self beneath the layers. All of them are true in their time. All of them are you. What matters is awareness, the ability to ask who is speaking right now and why, and then to respond not with judgment but with understanding. because the others inside you are not enemies. They are echoes, they are messages, they are memories speaking in present tense. And when you see them clearly, they soften. They stop pulling so hard. They stop fighting for attention. They become companions, not saboteurs. And you, who are you really? You are the space where they all belong. Before you ever made a decision, decisions were made for you. You were handed a language, a name, a tone of voice shaped by the mouths that fed you. You were shown which emotions were safe, which dreams were acceptable, which questions were too loud for the room you were in. And without realizing it, you downloaded all of it. Not as a conscious act, but as survival, as obedience mistaken for truth, as mimicry mistaken for self. These were your default settings, not the result of reflection, but of repetition. And long before you could say I, the shape of your identity was already being sculpted. You learned what love looked like from people who were still learning to love themselves. You learned what strength meant from those who feared vulnerability. You learned silence from moments too tense to interrupt. You learned how to apologize before you learned how to ask. These weren't rules you wrote. They were patterns absorbed through proximity. And because they arrived early, they became invisible. They didn't feel like choices. They felt like personalities, like this is just how you are. But beneath that feeling is a quieter truth. Most of what you call you was installed without your input. It's not your fault. That's how the human system works. We're built to adapt, to mimic, to mold ourselves to the culture we're born into. And the earlier the lesson, the deeper it goes. Not just into the mind, but into the nervous system, the muscles, the reflexes, the way you brace when you're criticized, the way you rush to explain yourself before anyone asks, the way you downplay joy to avoid envy. These aren't decisions, they're code. They're scripts written in rooms you don't remember, by voices you trusted long before you had words for trust. And yet you carry them forward. You walk through the world, reacting to rules you didn't agree to. You avoid confrontation not because it's unsafe now, but because it was once. You hesitate before asking for more. Not because you're greedy, but because you were taught to be grateful for less. You overthink, not because you're broken, but because someone once made you feel that mistakes were dangerous. These behaviors are not flaws, they are adaptations. And they only feel automatic because they've been repeated. But repetition is not the truth. Familiarity is not fate, and default is not destiny. The self as you experience it is partly a program, a collection of responses shaped by what kept you included, unpunished or invisible. And when those defaults go unexamined, they define your sense of possibility. Not with force, but with quiet limits. You don't try certain things because you've never seen them work. You don't speak about certain feelings because they weren't welcomed. You don't imagine beyond a certain point because you were taught not to reach, not directly, not with punishment, just with silence, just with no response. And so the loop begins. The default becomes identity. Identity becomes limitation. Limitation becomes self-preservation. And the more you succeed within those limits, the more real they seem. You learn to live within the settings, not because they're right, but because they're familiar. And familiarity becomes comfort, even when it stifles. But the moment you notice a setting is a setting, it begins to loosen. Not vanish, but loosen. You realize I don't actually believe this. I just learned it. You realize your voice softens when you speak about what you want. Not because you're timid, but because you were trained to ask small questions. You realize your laugh changes depending on who's in the room. Not because you're inauthentic, but because you were taught to adapt. And in that realization, something unlocks. The possibility that you are not the setting, you are the one experiencing it. You may not know what your real voice sounds like. You may not know what you'd choose if the options weren't shaped by expectation. But that unknowing is sacred. That hesitation is not confusion. It's awakening. The first sign that the defaults are no longer running unopposed. The first flicker of free space in a system that used to run on script. You don't need to rewrite everything at once. You don't need to know what's real and what's learned. You only need to pause. Ask, did I choose this? Not with judgment, not to blame, just to see, because seeing is what makes it shift. Once you see a setting, you can change it, or let it stay. But either way, the choice is finally yours. And maybe that's what healing really is, not erasing the defaults, but learning to choose beyond them, not escaping the past, but outgrowing its grip. Not becoming someone new, but remembering that you were never meant to live as someone else's version of you. You are not your default settings. You are the awareness that outlives them. You say I as if it's a clear thing, as if the speaker and the voice are one, as if the word belongs to a stable center, a core that stays untouched through time and change. But the truth is more complicated, more dreamlike, because each time you say I, a different version of you might be speaking. The child, the skeptic, the caretaker, the one who performs, the one who protects. Sometimes even someone else's words, long ago absorbed, now delivered in your tone. Each time you speak from I, the voice might be yours in sound, but not in origin. And still, it feels real. You say, I'm tired, and the body agrees. You say, I'm fine, and the mask holds steady. You say, I can't do this, and the voice trembles like truth. But beneath the sentence, who is deciding? Which self is responding? Is it the one who learned silence was safer? Is it the one who fears being misunderstood? Is it the one who's still trying to please someone who is no longer listening? You call them all I without question, because the voice comes from inside. But inside is not singular. Inside is a room full of echoes. You've learned to speak in a way that makes sense to the world. You've edited your sentences to match expectations. You've added hesitation, softened conviction, trained your voice to fit the context. And after enough time, the edited version of you becomes the default. You say I and mean it, but the sentence was pre-written. The shape of it was decided by scripts you didn't realize you were following. You say, this is just how I am. But sometimes that's just how you've been conditioned to be. And when you pause, when you catch yourself mid-thought, you notice the fracture. You feel the delay between the voice and the self. You sense that the I who spoke wasn't the one you meant to invite. That a different version answered. The old one, the rehearsed one, the one who's been here longest. And you wonder, how long have I been speaking on autopilot? How many times have I called someone else's belief my own, just because it arrived in my voice? This is the paradox of personhood. We experience ourselves as singular, but we are plural. We speak as one, but we think in layers. There is no central I, only a rotating cast of selves who borrow the pronoun and fill it with their fears, their hopes, their habits, and none of them are lying. Each one believes it's you. That's what makes it convincing. That's what makes it hard to question. Because the voice sounds like yours. Because the thoughts use your grammar. But awareness changes the dynamic when you begin to hear the differences. When you notice the shift in tone, the language of defense, the patterns of old pain, you realize that I is not a statement of fact. It's a mask, a placeholder, a pronoun passed between parts of you, each answering in turn, each shaped by context, memory, need. Sometimes the I that speaks is a child who wasn't heard. Sometimes it's a parent who taught you how to speak. Sometimes it's a stranger you picked up from a book, a friend, a fear, a loss. And still you say I, and the world believes. But you don't have to believe it uncritically. You can hear the sentence and ask, who just spoke? Not to judge, not to resist, just to witness. Because once you hear the difference, you don't get pulled into the story as easily. You don't accept every I feel as a final truth. You don't mistake every inner voice for your actual voice. You start to notice the rotation, the inner switching, the way the self adapts without asking. And through that noticing, a different kind of self emerges, not one who speaks louder, but one who listens better. Not a new character, but a quiet host, the one who watches the others speak, the one who doesn't need to declare I to exist, the one who doesn't need a story to feel real. This is the self behind the self, the silent presence, the one who says nothing but sees everything. It watches you say, I'm not enough, and feels the sadness underneath. It hears you say, I don't care, and knows you do. It listens when you say, I'm fine, and notices the tightness in your chest. It isn't correct. It doesn't replace it. It simply holds the space while the others speak. And maybe that's the most honest version of I you'll ever find. Not the one who speaks first, but the one who listens last. The one who allows all your inner selves to take their turn, but doesn't mistake any one of them for the whole. So each time you say I, pause. Notice who answers. Notice whose script you're following. Notice if the voice is rushed, rehearsed, resigned. And then ask gently, is this the self I want speaking for me? Not always to replace it. Sometimes just to acknowledge it. Sometimes just to let it finish without taking control. You are not wrong for having many selves. You are not broken for hearing different voices. You are only human, layered, fluid, evolving. And the more you notice, the more space you create. The more space you create, the softer the voices become. They stop fighting. They start listening to each other. And in that space, something stable forms. Not a fixed identity, but a field of presence where the word I no longer needs to carry the weight of being complete. Dust on a mirror. 1,000 small impressions, comments, glances, half-formed worries, familiar doubts. And by evening you carry all of it. Not as weight exactly, but as noise. You've rehearsed the role. You've responded in the usual way. You've replayed the same internal scripts, sometimes without noticing. And by the time night arrives, it's not that you're exhausted. It's that you've been so many versions of yourself in one day. You don't know which one to carry into tomorrow. But then comes midnight. a quiet threshold, the moment where the world changes the date, even if nothing else has changed, no sound, no flash, just a soft line drawn in time's invisible sand. And though you might still be awake, something in you responds, something ancient, something slow, as if a small system inside begins to power down, not to sleep, but to reset. You don't need to erase anything. You don't need to understand everything. You just need the cycle to end. To complete the loop, another can begin. This is the soft reboot. It doesn't arrive with resolution. It doesn't bring answers. It brings silence, a clearing of mental cache, a reset of emotional background processes. You don't forget the day, but you release its momentum. You allow your system to close the tabs, even if they never finished loading. You let the open questions remain unanswered for now. You let the inner chatter quiet, not because it's resolved, but because it's tired. And in that quiet, identity loosens. The names you answered to fade. The roles you filled step back into the shadows. You stop being the version of yourself that held it together, or said the right things, or carried the doubts like furniture from room to room. You let that version rest. You let the self dissolve. Not dramatically, but gently. The edges soften. The posture eases. The mind exhales. You don't become empty. You become clean. Not blank, not erased, just open again. This is not a reinvention. It's a return. To stillness, to space, to the unscripted, to the self that doesn't need to perform, or narrate or know. The self that doesn't need to be the same tomorrow, because that's the quiet gift of midnight. It doesn't ask you to improve. It just offers you a gap, a moment between selves, a space wide enough to breathe without becoming anything at all. And somehow, in that non-becoming, something real stirs, not a new identity, not a better thought, just a truth too soft to speak during the day, a truth that only arrives when everything else goes silent. The part of you that never rushed, that never doubted, that never had to explain itself to be valid. You feel it even if you don't name it, a kind of internal gravity returning to center, a pulse beneath the surface, the awareness that nothing you carry today is required tomorrow, that the stories can be paused, that the roles can be set down, that nothing about your inner landscape is fixed, not even the parts that pretend to be permanent. And when morning comes, you won't remember the exact moment it happened. You won't remember what was released, what was rewritten, what was reset. That's the point. The reboot isn't about memory, it's about release. It's about trusting that the system repairs itself when you stop interfering. That identity, like breath, can regulate on its own, if given the space. So let it happen. Let the self dissolve like mist at the edge of sleep. Let the thoughts trail off without endings. Let the day go without perfect closure. You are not a machine to be optimized. You are not a narrative to be completed. You are a system that resets gently, in quiet, in softness, in the dark, not to become better, just to begin again. Some things are said only once, a single phrase, dropped into a quiet room. A comment passed without intention, a tone, sharp or soft, that vibrates longer than the words themselves. And though the voice disappears, the shape of it lingers. Not in memory, in reaction, in posture, in the way your breath shortens before certain conversations, in the way your shoulders tilt when someone speaks with that rhythm. You can't always remember what was said or who said it, but you know how it felt. You remember the echo. You've been carrying it ever since. Voices are supposed to fade, people leave, time passes, rooms empty, but echoes don't need the speaker to survive. They don't even need volume. They survive through repetition, through internal rehearsal, through the quiet space where you replay what was said, not just to understand it, but to anticipate it. You tell yourself you're preparing, that if you remember it well enough, you won't be surprised next time. But there is no next time. The voice is gone. The echo stayed. And now it speaks in your place. You hear it in how you pause before celebrating yourself, in how you shrink from being seen, in how quickly you retreat when something starts to feel too close. You think it's instinct, but it's a script. You think it's modesty, but it's memory. A defense system built from a sentence someone else forgot. They moved on. You didn't. And now the echo has become your own voice, shaping decisions, softening desires, delaying joy. The original voice may have come from someone you trusted, or feared, or needed. That's what gives the echo power, not the content, but the source. You didn't question it at the time because it felt larger than you. You absorbed it not as opinion, but as truth, and once it entered, it didn't leave. It adapted, it dressed in new language, it changed form. It started to sound like a thought you came up with, like something logical, like something mature. But if you trace it, if you really follow the thread, you'll find that it began in someone else's mouth. This is the echo that outlives the voice. It doesn't need a body anymore. It doesn't need a speaker. It just needs familiarity. Because the mind doesn't always believe what's real. It believes what's been repeated. The more times a thought occurs, the more truthful it feels. And so the echo circles back. It shows up at the edges of opportunity. It appears when you're about to try something new. It whispers doubt in the voice of caution. And it sounds reasonable because you've heard it before. But repetition is not accuracy. Familiarity is not evidence. And just because a voice echoes doesn't mean it deserves to speak. You may find yourself reacting to people who aren't in the room, guarding against judgments that haven't been made, apologizing for needs no one's challenged. That's the echo. It lives in anticipation. It speaks before you do. And the most difficult part is, it doesn't feel external anymore. It feels like you. Not because it is, but because it's been inside long enough to wear your tone. You want to be free from it. But freedom doesn't come from arguing with the echo. It comes from noticing it. Gently, without shame, you hear the voice rise again. You'll fail. This is too much. They won't understand. And you don't try to silence it. You name it. You say, "This is not me. This is a memory." And slowly the volume decreases. You might not remember the original moment, the voice that began it. That's okay. You don't need the full scene to rewrite the rhythm. You only need to know when the pattern is no longer yours. You only need to pause before repeating the same loop. You only need to choose not to believe something, even if it still feels familiar. The echo will still rise, but your response doesn't have to. This isn't about healing all at once. It's about making space for new voices, voices that speak in your cadence, voices that reflect your present, not your past, voices that weren't planted in fear or scarcity but grown in clarity. You'll know them by how they feel. They don't rush, they don't brace, they don't need you to earn safety before offering softness. They arrive quietly, but when they speak, they don't echo. They resonate. You may never fully silence the echo. That's not failure. That's history. But you can change the room it speaks into. You can fill that space with enough presence that the echo has somewhere to dissolve. You can speak after it, not to argue, but to add, to include the voice that was once quieted, to give it shape to the self that didn't get to speak the first time. Because the echo is not the ending. It's the last line of a story that is still being revised. You are not responsible for what was said to you, but you are free to decide what stays. You are not the echo. You are the one who hears it and chooses not to believe it anymore. Some places hold you long after you've gone. Not in the physical sense, not in walls or furniture, but in the invisible shape your presence once left behind. You step back into a room and the air feels familiar, not because you recognize it, but because it remembers you. The silence has texture. The light falls in a way that feels practiced. The floor creaks in the same rhythm, as if it expects your footsteps. You didn't think it would feel like anything, but it does. The room remembers. You notice how your body changes as you cross the threshold. You walk differently. You think in older tones. You react to things that aren't there anymore. Not ghosts, echoes. You become the version of yourself that lived here. That used to sit in this corner. That used to cry in that one. The furniture may be different, but the posture returns. The loop finds you, and suddenly you're not just standing in a space, you're standing in a version of your own past. Because rooms absorb. Not literally, but in feeling, in vibration, in repetition, every glance, every word, every tension left unspoken. The space collects them, not as artifacts, but as atmospheres. You may forget what happened, but the room doesn't. It holds the outline of your presence, the shape of your absence, the invisible weight of what was said too late or never said at all. It becomes part of the architecture, not in design, but in sensation. This is why some spaces feel heavy without explanation, why you enter a room and feel smaller, or louder, or like you're waiting for something to go wrong. It's not the space itself. It's what was once said in it, what was believed there, what was practiced over and over until the energy hardened into walls. The room carries the rhythm of the people who filled it, and when you return, it asks you to match that rhythm again. But you don't have to. You are allowed to move differently. This time, you are allowed to bring your new voice into old silence. You are allowed to stand taller in a doorway that once asked you to shrink. Because the room may remember you, but it doesn't define you. And your presence now has weight too, enough to shift the atmosphere, to reprogram the space, to let the room meet a version of you it hasn't held before. Still, it's hard not to slip into old shapes. Your hand reaches for the same light switch even though it's been moved. Your thoughts return to the arguments you never finished. You hear footsteps that aren't there. You pause before speaking, out of habit. Not because anyone is listening, but because someone once was, and they taught you, without saying it, what parts of yourself to withhold in this space. You want to believe you're past that you've outgrown the old patterns, but the room pulls at you gently, not to trap you, to remind you of who you were, of what you survived, of how many times you performed safety just to get through the day. The room is not trying to hurt you, It's trying to complete a loop that was never closed, and that loop can only be closed by returning, not as the person who left, but as the one who has become. You enter again not to repeat the past, but to reintroduce yourself. You walk through the same doorway, but this time you're listening for different echoes. You hear the silence, but you don't interpret it as threat. You remember what happened, but you're no longer bound by it. You see your reflection in the window and realize the room is still here. But the self who once lived here isn't. There is power in being witnessed by a space that saw you before. There is healing in showing up as someone new. You don't need to declare anything. You don't need to prove growth. You just need to be present and let the room adjust. It will. Slowly, it will let go of the posture it memorized. It will let the light fall differently. It will absorb this new version too, because rooms, like people, can change. They are shaped by presence. They are rewritten by attention, and the more you show up fully, the more the space reflects it back. A place once known for pain can become known for peace. A room once used for hiding can become a place of return, not because the past is erased, but because the present is stronger. You leave again, but not in the same way. You don't vanish. You don't shrink. You leave your shape behind, not the old one, but the new. You leave your breath in the air. You leave a silence that no longer braces. And the room quietly remembers. Not the version of you who suffered, but the one who stood still and stayed long enough to be seen. The more I try to define myself, the more I begin to disappear. I say I, and it echoes, not with clarity, but with distance. The closer I look, the more the self seems to scatter into thoughts, reactions, roles, memories. I trace my reflection, and it pulls away. What felt solid in passing becomes fog under focus. This is the paradox of consciousness. The thinker who tries to hold itself becomes ungraspable. The more I think, the less I remain. I am the I that disappears by trying to see itself. It begins innocently. A question. Who am I, really? What do I believe? Why do I speak the way I speak? Why do I choose what I choose? I follow the thread inward, expecting answers, but each thought only leads to more thoughts. Each reason loops into another explanation, and before long I'm surrounded by mirrors, each reflecting a version of me that vanishes as soon as I try to hold it still. Identity, under direct attention, becomes vapor. It's only real when I'm not looking. I used to think thinking would bring me closer to truth, that the deeper I understood myself, the clearer I'd become. But thought is not a light. It's a tunnel. It leads, but never arrives. It maps, but never touches. I can describe myself endlessly and still feel like I've said nothing real, because the words, however precise, are shadows of something softer, something that refuses definition. The more I speak of myself, the more distant I feel from the one who's speaking. There is a strange silence beneath thought, not the absence of ideas, but the absence of trying. It's the place where breath is enough, where presence replaces narration, where the self doesn't need to be proven. It simply is. But that place is fragile. The moment I try to explain it, it folds. The moment I ask if I'm doing it right, it disappears. The mind rushes in with its catalogs and checklists, and the softness collapses, and I vanish again into concepts, identities, descriptions. I am not my thoughts, but my thoughts think me. They move before I summon them. They interpret before I choose. They echo voices that are not mine, in rhythms I did not invent. And when I try to resist, to find something purer underneath, I find only more thought, more echoes, more abstraction. I try to find a center, but there is none, only awareness watching itself trying to be whole. This is not emptiness, it's spaciousness, it's not loss, it's loosening. The vanishing is not a disappearance, it's a return to something deeper than name, something that doesn't need to be called I to be real. The self, as I've known it, is a function, a useful illusion, a mask that points but doesn't contain, and behind it is nothing I can explain. But it breathes, it sees, it is. There's freedom in this vanishing. A strange peace in realizing I don't need to be a single, stable self to be whole. I can let the stories fall. I can stop trying to fit every thought into a coherent identity. I can just move and feel and shift. The self doesn't need to be watched. It needs to be lived. And yet the mind resists. It wants solidity. It wants continuity. It wants to know what I means. So it tries again, defining, refining, looping, and I vanish again. Not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet way that happens when I'm more concerned with understanding than being. I become the description, not the experience. But the truth lives outside of words. It lives in sensation, in noticing the wind without naming it, in feeling without framing, in walking without watching every step. That's where I return. Not as a person with perfect insight, but as presence without a narrator. I am not the one who thinks. I am the space where thought passes through. And so I vanish again and again, not into absence, but into awareness, not into confusion, but into freedom. The I who needs to be consistent disappears, and what's left is softer, looser, enough. Maybe the goal was never to hold on. Maybe the real self is the one that doesn't cling. Maybe identity is not a destination, but a process of continual release, I think. And in thinking, I vanish. And that vanishing is how I return. Not every memory is a record. Some are blueprints. They don't reflect what happened. They build it. They arrive before the moment does, whispering what it will mean, how it will feel, how it will end. And when the moment comes, we follow the script. We react to the memory instead of the reality. We move through a scene we think is new, not realizing it was rehearsed in us long before we entered the room. You remember someone before you meet them. Not their face, but their type. Not their voice, but the role they might play. You recall how this story usually ends, how this dynamic usually unfolds, and the memory takes over. You brace, you soften, you disappear. You recreate the moment you thought you were escaping just because it feels familiar. And after you say, I knew this would happen. But maybe it didn't happen until you expected it to. Memory is not just recall, it's projection. It colors the light, distorts the timing, edits the dialogue. It shapes how we enter each interaction. You say they made me feel small, but maybe you arrived already shrinking. You say this reminds me of when I was left, but maybe the moment hadn't left you until you reminded it. The body hears memory faster than the mind does. The nervous system reacts before the present has a chance to prove itself. And so the moment becomes something else. Not a new experience, but a reprint. The present is filtered through the lens of what was. You're not just responding to this person, this choice, this silence. You're responding to every echo it resembles, every ache it rhymes with, every version of yourself who felt this before. And suddenly, you're not here anymore. You're back there, in a room you thought you left, in a feeling you thought had passed. But here's the paradox. The moment isn't fixed until you remember it. What you felt then becomes what you believe happened. The belief hardens, and the next moment arrives to fulfill it. And the loop continues. Not because the world is repeating, but because memory is recursive. It doesn't just hold the past, it sculpts the now. You tell yourself, I'm always left, I'm always misunderstood. This never works out. And the present, eager to be understood, rises to meet that expectation. Your mind selects the details that match the story. It edits out what doesn't fit. And the moment becomes a match, not to reality, but to the memory that came before it. Sometimes the memory is imagined, a story told so often it feels true, a fear rehearsed so vividly it feels lived, a scene constructed from hope or dread that lodges itself like fact. You swear it happened, you feel it in your bones. But maybe it didn't. Maybe the feeling came first and the story followed. Maybe the belief needed a setting, and so you invented one. That doesn't make it false, but it does make it flexible. Because if memory can invent the moment, it can also be revised. Not by forcing a new story, but by loosening the old one, by seeing that the present is not the past, that the person in front of you is not the person who left, that this silence doesn't mean abandonment, that this feeling doesn't prove the loop. You don't have to deny your history. You only need to stop handing it the pen. Let the moment be new. Let it arrive without context. Let it speak for itself before memory interprets it. That doesn't mean forgetting. It means pausing before you project. It means breathing before you brace. It means asking, is this memory writing the scene, or am I actually here? Some of the most powerful memories were never real, but they became real the moment we believed in them, the moment they shaped our behavior, the moment they influenced what we allowed, what we avoided, what we called love, what we called truth. But belief doesn't need to be a life sentence. It can be a doorway. You can open it again. You can walk through with different eyes. You don't need to be free of the past to be free in the present. You only need to remember that memory is not the moment. That feeling something again doesn't mean it's happening again. That the body can unlearn what it once rehearsed. That a new moment can begin, even in the presence of the old one. And maybe that's the real work, not erasing memory, but unhooking it from prediction, letting it live in the past without owning the now, letting it inform, but not define, letting it rest, because the moment is still here, and it's trying to speak for itself. Not every part of you moves forward. Some stay, in the place where something ended too soon, in the moment you weren't ready for, in the goodbye you whispered, but never fully believed. A version of you stays behind, not because it wants to, but because it wasn't finished. It lingers in the hallway, in the pause after the sentence, in the quiet between who you were and who you had to become. And though you've kept walking, part of you is still there, waiting. You grow, you adapt, you become. But sometimes you feel it, the tug of something left in a place you don't visit anymore, a silence in your chest when a certain street name is mentioned, a flicker of resistance when joy comes too easily. Not regret, not nostalgia, something harder to name. A presence shaped like your absence, a self you outpaced but never quite released. You might think of that version as weaker or smaller. You might look back with embarrassment or with grief. But that self was real. That self tried. That self made choices with what it had. And though it didn't make it all the way here, it didn't vanish. It stayed. And it's still there now, not in your shadow, but in your timeline. A parallel self who froze at the border of a turning point and remained. Maybe it stayed in the room where you decided not to speak. Maybe it stayed in the last moment you trusted someone who didn't hold you right. Maybe it stayed in a dream you had to abandon, or a version of love that never landed. Wherever it is, it's not angry. It's not trying to come back. It just wants to be seen. It wants to be acknowledged as part of your becoming, not as a failure, but as a stage. We're not taught to look back gently. We're taught to move on, to let go, to reinvent. But some versions of you don't need erasing. They need honoring. They need someone to say, "You did the best you could. You weren't wrong for staying. You weren't weak for breaking. You were just early." That's all, just early. Because sometimes the self that stayed behind was the first to arrive at a feeling, the first to sense the fracture, the first to realize something was missing. They didn't have the tools, they didn't have the words, but they were aware, and that awareness shaped your path. You left the room, but only because they stood still long enough for you to see where the doorway was. You don't owe them rescue. You don't need to go back and fix the moment. But you can return. In memory, in presence, in stillness, you can sit with the version of yourself who never moved past the moment. You can offer them your breath. You can let them know you didn't fail. You held the line until I was ready to move, and that's enough. That's more than enough. There is no shame in having stayed. There is no failure in having lingered too long. The self that stayed behind wasn't waiting for you to come back and rescue them. They were waiting to be reintegrated, not as an old wound, but as a foundation, a piece of you that allowed the rest to grow. We live many lives within a single life. Some end quietly, some end without closure, and the version of you that stayed behind may always live at that edge. But that doesn't mean they're stuck. It means they're rooted in a truth you once needed, in a lesson you carry, in a softness you almost forgot. You don't need to be the same person forever, but you also don't need to be a stranger to who you were. You can hold all yourselves, those who moved forward and those who paused. You can let them meet. You can let them speak. You can let them rest. And when you walk forward, you don't have to leave them behind anymore. Because they're not behind. They're within. They've been here all along, waiting for the moment when you could finally say, "You were never less than me. You were never the one who stayed. You were the first version of me brave enough to stop,